Hello, good morning. Hello, everyone. It looks like you're all populating and appearing. We are so excited to have everyone. I see lots of people coming up on the screen now. This is terrific. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolina Illick, the Central APA Professional Development Officer, and I'm also the Planning Manager at the City of Fresno Transportation Department. And we have a great program lined up for you today with a wide variety of panelists from both California and from throughout the nation. Today's focus is on equity, and as you know, equity is a central platform for the American Planning Association, as well as a key tenet in the definition of sustainability, which focuses on economy, environment, and equity. Since the death of George Floyd, attention has been focused around the nation and the world on issues of race and equity. We've seen major sports teams, banks, healthcare institutions, insurance companies, corporations, and leading athletes all take actions toward greater equity. Race and equity has also been a key topic in the presidential election. And we're seeing it in the news like never before. In fact, I have a sampling of newspaper headlines and editorials that I wanted to briefly read to you about this point. So for example, California should restore affirmative action with Prop 16. Plan would give communities of color a break from hazards. Fresno school trustee votes against anti-racism resolution. How to win the Latino vote in the presidential election. Latinos hold about half of the county's political offices. Kamala Harris faces sexist, racist comments after the debate. College district campaign mailer called out as racist. Clovis racism rooted in housing discrimination. Policy's goals are to increase grocers and shrink liquor stores. And finally, even in the world of entertainment, the trial of the Chicago 7 resonates across the decades. So as you can see, discussion is happening everywhere about this topic. Last June, the Central APA hosted a 2-hour equity workshop, and it was entitled Addressing Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Our Local Communities, What is the Role of Planners? We had over 500 participants with very meaningful participation. And when we looked at those evaluation surveys, what we found is that the guests really liked the workshop, and they also wanted to continue to learn and have some more in-depth hands-on training with specific steps that planners can take in our profession to help address this issue. So this workshop is a direct result from that. Since then, the Central section has appointed 2 diversity and equity co-chairs, and I'll be introducing them in a moment. And the California chapter, as you know, has a number of resources as well. So quick overview of the program. We have 2 sections today, Equity 101 and Equity 102. Equity 101 is going to be focused on understanding race and equity issues with a wide range of topics, housing, public health, gentrification, and transportation, and we'll be featuring both speakers and videos. Equity 102, which will be the afternoon portion, is focused on steps that planners can take, including on topics such as the workforce, systemic citywide approaches, displacement, general plans, and implementing Senate Bill 1000. Interspersed with our presentations are going to be some interactive surveys and breakouts. And I wanted to just mention that the breakouts are intentionally and specifically included as part of the program as a way to help participants reflect upon the content and learn more from one another. In addition, the program that you should have received today with the link that Ben sent out, it's full of resources and links. And I really encourage you to take a moment to really delve through and go through those resources. So I'm going to be emceeing the event today, and we're going to be encouraging the use of the chat feature for questions and answers. And I want to thank Ben Morrison. He's our technical guru from the California chapter. He's going to be helping with that. So if we have any issues, he'll be addressing those. Wanted to remind you that the program is going to be recorded, and we'll make that recording available after the session. And those of you that are AICP can get your certification maintenance credits as well. And finally, after the workshop, we'll be providing a survey, and that will come through to you through SurveyMonkey. And we really encourage you to respond to the survey questions. We want to thank you for spending your time with us today and for your commitment to help address issues of race and equity in the planning field. I'd like to close my comments by recognizing that no one person has all of the answers, but that education is a key part of the solution. The more we know, The more aware we become, the more we talk about all of the issues, the more we can make a difference at all levels, at our personal level, at the organizational level, and at the institutional level. So with that, I would now like to introduce the Central Section's 2 diversity co-chairs, and those are Mario Anaya and Casey Lauderdale. So with that, we'll go ahead and have them make some introductions as well.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us here today. My name is Casey, and I'm going to kick us off with just a short review of some highlights that we had from a survey that we sent to our members last month. And Mario is going to talk about a working group that we're putting together. So Mario, if you're available to share the slides, I'll go through those. Thanks. So as I mentioned, we did a survey with our Central Section membership last month, and there was one highlight that we wanted to share on this meeting. If you'll go to the next slide. So we asked what resources and training would be most useful for APA Central Section to provide at this time. And what we found in the results on the next slide was that the one that was most highly rated was practice tools to identify, rectify, and prevent disparities in communities, followed by very closely by 3 other topics, which would be history, education on the historic decisions and practices that have led to today's inequalities and those that still persist. Another under practice, case studies of equity and diversity efforts throughout the Central Section and California, and public participation, tools to promote equitable community engagement. So we wanted to share that highlight from the survey with everybody, just to show what the interest is among the membership in terms of learning more about the history and tools that are available on diversity, equity, inclusion. And if you'll go to the next slide. So Mario and I are working to uplift and provide resources on these topics, but we really want to open it up to anyone else who'd like to join us in doing so. And so we're working to establish a working group, and our first meeting will be November 10th from noon to 1 p.m. And if you have any interest in joining us for that, please email Mario or myself or both of us. I'll just read out our email addresses. It's casey.lauderdale@fresno.gov, casey.lauderdale@fresno.gov, and Mario's email address is manaya@tulare.ca.gov. And I'm going to turn it over to Mario now to talk a little bit more about the working group platform. And the working group is for the Central Section members. But we'd be happy to hear from anyone else about ideas in terms of, because we want whatever we come up with in our section, we of course would love to share with everybody. So.
Thank you, Casey. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I want to thank California APA and our section board for being supportive of really adding some energy. Carolina, thank you as our professional development officer for really getting some energy around this topic, not only in our section, which certainly was lacking, but working throughout the state. We all have great resources to share, so I'll just second what Casey said. This working group and the work plan I'm going to share here is for the Central Section of APA, but we'd love to collaborate with any other planners throughout the state or throughout the country on how we can best give the time and energy required to address these topics in our everyday planning work. So to be responsive to the topics here that we were covered in the survey, as Casey mentioned, these were some of the top responses we received. So to cover the history, we actually started a book discussion on The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. So that is, we've had part 1 of this discussion. It was September 29th. We had 7 participants. Our section is very geographically vast, but underpopulated compared to some of the larger urban areas. So with 7 participants, we actually had a really in-depth conversation on this very fascinating and interesting book, but it also garnered quite a bit of interest. I've received some emails from some folks who, one, needed a little more time to get through it, and also just to break it into a second part discussion where we can talk about, the first part was more about the history and how we got here, which dovetails really well with today's workshop, part Equity 101, so to speak. And then part 2 was some tools we can use as planners to focus on addressing some of these issues and some of these topics. So our work plan for our section, we were glad that the survey results really did reflect and tied in nicely with some of the things we were working on. So the first goal was creating the survey, which was completed, and we thank everyone who participated and provided that feedback that we needed. Casey covered the working group and the book discussion I just discussed. If anybody wants any further information on these, for how you can provide these resources or discussions in your section, or even just to participate, feel free to reach out to Casey or I. And then we do have more midterm goals. Thank you all for being part of our half-day workshop. We did receive great response from the last workshop we had that we wanted a more in-depth version. This is it. And thank you, Carolina, for all your work in putting this together. We do have some goals for early 2021 that'll focus on things that we'll discuss as part of the working group, such as case studies, best practices, and we'd like to put together webinars or workshops to discuss those. We also have a workshop that we're shooting to schedule in 2021 on covering this topic in the workplace culture, but also making sure we're aware of this when we're hosting public meetings and generally interacting with our communities as planners. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Carolina.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm just so happy that we have 2 diversity and equity co-chairs here in the central area, and a big kudos and thanks to both Casey and Mario for all of the efforts. You can see that we have a really, really good work program, and we're just really excited to kick off this work. With that, the program calls for us introducing Maru Desai, who's the Vice President of Equity for the California chapter of the APA, but Maru got called into a meeting and can't join us right now. So instead, we're going to flip the program around a little bit and introduce Julia Lade Johnston, who's the California chapter president of the American Planning Association. And Julia is going to give a few brief remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Carolina. It's great to be with you here today. After watching that presentation, it's no surprise that our central section, California APA, the largest chapter in the nation, has 8 sections. And it's no surprise the central section won an award for being the outstanding section of the year recently. You guys have been doing great programming, and I really appreciate the program you put together today. So diversity, equity, inclusion has been a very important topic for California APA for the past several years. Of course, recently it's really come into the headlines, as Carolina pointed out, and we've been much more focused on it, but it really has been something that we have been trying to address for the past couple of years. How to increase the diversity in our membership, how to increase the diversity in our leadership, how can we better serve the diverse communities that we work in. At our past conference in September, we had several big conversations, and this idea of how does planning contribute to systemic racism? How can we make a difference in our communities? How can we right some of our past wrongs and move forward collectively? Was one of the major issues we focused on. And I really appreciate this continuation of that conversation that our sections have been having, and we will continue to have those dialogues. To me, it's not a matter of, oh, we've done things wrong in the past. It's more, how can we do better moving forward? How can we help our communities be more equitable and more sustainable? How can we engage everybody in that conversation? And I know that we all share that goal as planners, that idea of engaging our communities to create better communities. So I think that this is a perfect extension of that conversation, and I really want to thank the Central Section for having it. We do have a number of resources on the APA website. I will put a link to that into the chat. You do have to be a member, unfortunately, to access those resources. Of course, I'd love for you all to become members if you're not. We also have a number of webinars that a lot of our sections have been doing, as well as some of some selections from our conference. Our big conversation #1, which was about planning and systemic racism, will be available on our website for free. So I hope that you'll check that out if you're interested in this topic. The last thing I want to say before we get started is I want to do a plug for the New York chapter, which does an annual conference every year called Hindsight. They've been doing it for several years. It's all about diversity, equity, inclusion. Very affordable. It's online this year. If you're interested, you can just Google Hindsight, and it is selling out. They have 900 people registered. They expect to sell out at 1,000. So please, if you're interested, do check that out. It'll be a very interesting conference, and they're focusing on healthcare this year. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for being here and continuing this really important conversation. I'm looking forward to a very exciting day.
Okay, thank you so much, Julia, and thanks for your leadership on the statewide level. Really appreciate that. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and get started, Equity 101. And the first thing we're going to do is watch a video, and the video is called Race and Redlining, Housing, Segregation, and Everything. This provides a really good jumping off point. So with that, Ben, if you can bring up the video, we will go from there. Okay, so I think that video is so incredibly comprehensive and really sets the stage for practically every topic that we're going to discuss today. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lisa Berglund, and she's an assistant professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada. So she's joining us today, and she's going to be talking about public health and social injustice with a Detroit case study that she worked on. So Lisa, we'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I think that video is, like you just mentioned, a great segue, I think, for a lot of the aspects that I want to talk about here. And you can see the shared screen fine?
Yes.
Okay, great. So today I want to talk about some of my research on environmental justice in Detroit, and particularly I want to get into how land use decisions and how we think about municipal budgets can really play into some of the narratives that imply the expendability of communities of color. And I want to tell you about a community that is sometimes referred to as Boynton, but actually is often called by its zip code, which is 48217. And 48217 is a majority Black community in the majority Black city of Detroit, and this community experiences disinvestment and adverse health outcomes of being in very close proximity to noxious industries, things like petroleum production, several steel mills, coal-powered energy plants, and so many more. But actually 48217 is called the most polluted zip code in Michigan. And residents suffer from cancer, asthma, renal failure, emphysema, and a lot of other diseases as a result of this. So this community and their planning history and their practices of resistance to these planning practices really provide a lot of lessons for how environmental racism really develops and how it's oftentimes economically rationalized. Okay, sorry. So here's the community we're talking about here. So it's this is the city of Detroit, and so this little dog leg here, the southernmost tip, is where we're talking about. So you might wonder, why would you call a community by its zip code 48217 instead of a more kind of traditional neighborhood name? But there's a lot of different explanations for this, and a lot of those speak to the use of this name as really a form of resistance in itself. So some have said it's a form of a show of unity when a couple of different things have happened. So when the highway split the zip code in two pieces, for example, or when racialized gerrymandering cut the zip code kind of strangely into two congressional districts. So a way of saying you can use policy, you can use these strategies to divide us, but we're still united as the zip code. And I want to begin by talking, I want to start by talking about kind of the planning and land use decisions that have really led to some of these conditions of pollution and disinvestment. So just to give you a quick background about how this area became so industrialized, we have the Ford Rouge plant that opened in the 1920s that you may know of because it's become kind of this icon of environmental degradation at the hands of industry. The Detroit Salt Company, a coal-powered energy plant, again, multiple steel mills, and the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department also operates out of the area. But in terms of footprint, the largest industrial operation here is actually the Marathon Oil Refinery, and it's very visible across kind of the landscape of this neighborhood. So even though there's this concentration that you see here of all these industries in and around 482 and 7, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, which is now known as EGLE, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, they consistently approve permit requests when industries make them. So in 482 and 7, as I've mentioned, you know, it's become very much racialized since at least the beginning of the 1900s. And it was originally an area, and this ties back to some of the things that we just heard in this video, but it was originally an area with Eastern European immigrants, but under segregation, a lot of Black families who oftentimes moved up from the South during the Great Migration, moved to this area specifically. And the reason for that is that this very polluted area was really one of the only, if not the only areas in the city that allowed Black homeownership at this time. Because again, as he mentioned in the video, because of this lack of racial covenants in the area. So it's really important to consider the role of planning in concentrating homeownership, Black wealth, in this area that is very toxic and provides very little opportunities in terms of more wealth accumulation. So these homes have pretty much just depressed in value since then. And a lot of homes today are valued around $10,000 to $20,000. So even if you got a fair market rate offer from that, you wouldn't really be able to move anywhere else. So this here is a map from the city's master plan in the 50s that is much the same today in terms of the close proximity of industrial zoning with residential zoning. So a historian from the state of Michigan kind of explained the mindset at this time, saying that the planning department determined that Southwest Detroit and surrounding neighborhoods would basically be heavy industrial, and they weren't going to invest in infrastructure and things to support residential uses. By the mid-50s, when this document I just showed was made, that became the official policy. So this mentality can also be seen in this 1970s urban design plan to redevelop the waterfront. So even though 482 and 7 is in very close proximity to both the Rouge River and the Detroit River that are kind of contiguous, they're linked bodies of water, city planners pretty much didn't really consider this community to be part of that plan. And you can see off to the side, it's actually completely cut out of the plan entirely. So the ways that this historically Black community is consistently framed as this industrial area with, you know, very little emphasis on it being a historically Black community with homeownership or its residential zoning, is still going on today. So here's a plan from what is called the Detroit Future City Framework, which was created by philanthropic foundations with some partnerships with the city. So this is basically a 50-year land use plan for the city. And this plan, even though it wasn't really officially adopted by the city verbatim, it's received endorsements from 2 different mayors and from the former planning director. And it's also played a big role in shaping public discourse on the future of land use in Detroit by suggesting that a lot of communities be rezoned for industrial or agricultural or rural uses in light of these widespread vacancies in the city. So it also proposes to roll back city infrastructure and services in some of these less populated areas, a term that has been known in kind of the shrinking cities discourse as right sizing. You kind of planning history buffs might know more, it's like urban triage. But there's very little evidence that this strategy actually enhances the economic bottom line of the city in Detroit specifically. And these strategies have also been known to be concentrated, these rollbacks be concentrated in areas that represent some of the lowest socioeconomic statuses in the city. So if we look here at what is being proposed down here for 48217, this reframing, I would say, and kind of dehumanizing of this community really continues, because this plan promotes or proposes that this area is rezoned as a large park and what is called green residential or a lower density residential, despite what we know about kind of the density of the homes here. So what is that? What are the impacts of this way of thinking about 48217 that really prioritizes this image as an industrial area? Well, we see here there's less money allocated to this area for blight removal, for example. School closures, again, as they mentioned in the video, school closures. This is Southwestern High School that was closed several years ago, which was the only high school serving 48217. You also have closure of community resources like the Kennedy Recreation Center that was a very important community anchor. It was reopened a couple years ago. So the result of this way of planning is that when they talk about relationships to the city, their relationship to the city, a lot of times residents just say that they feel forgotten. And so when we think about these long-term patterns of environmental racism or other kinds of spatial injustice, there's always another side to the story, right? And that is one of resistance. And in 48217, community members have mobilized to resist types of marginalization through development decisions by doing things like marching, by organizing with climate change action groups, and of course, attending public meetings, and even collecting their own data about the environmental quality of the area to kind of stand up to these regulating agencies that oftentimes disagree with them. So one resident explained how basically every little thing feels like a fight. So from some of the smallest amenities like streetlights to bigger things like closing schools, that if we don't fight for it, then we don't get it. And so here's a picture of residents protesting outside of the Marathon Refinery. Again, the solidarity with a lot of these environmental and climate change action groups. So here's a demonstration for climate action in partnership with the Sierra Club and some other groups in Detroit. And residents also show up, time and time again to speak at public hearings, even though it often feels to them like it's a futile effort, like they're going through the motions. So this picture right here was actually taken right when the Flint water crisis had just kind of really reached its peak in exposure, both nationally and internationally. And so you might remember Flint protesters holding up water bottles or baby bottles filled with contaminated water as this really powerful kind of imagery. So these residents in line here are actually holding up their asthma inhalers for that same reason. And in this act of solidarity with Flint over environmental racism issues. So one resident said, "We are reliving Flint, Michigan right now because the citizens came before the MDEQ and the EPA and everyone said, you're harming us, you're hurting us. They used a bottle of water to show, to illustrate, to explain, well, I have my asthma inhaler here tonight because I have to use it." So not only in 48217 and other parts of Southwest Detroit, not only are they talking about this relationship between race and environmental degradation there, but there's also this solidarity across Detroit and Flint, who also evoke this imagery, of course, of Black Lives Matter. So then here's a news article by a local resident also kind of speaking to some of those themes of solidarity. So there's another part of urban policy and planning that really kind of plays into these narratives of Black communities being expendable. And in this context of Detroit, which is a city that's under extreme fiscal austerity, the health of 48217 residents is oftentimes really put kind of in competition with the financial health of the city. And so this is often done by politicians. It's also done by the industries themselves that oftentimes argue that pollution in this area should persist because of the jobs and the tax base that these kind of industries bring to the city as a whole. So sometimes this trade-off and how they talk about it is not so subtle at all. So while Marathon Oil was negotiating with the city for a pretty significant tax abatement a few years ago, a city council member said, "There is nothing we need more than jobs. I'm very cognizant of the environmental and health issues in Southwest Detroit, but it's a balancing act and we need to weigh that in our decisions." But residents oftentimes point out that this is a false equivalency, right? And that they are dehumanized by these conversations that essentially pit their health against the finances of the city. And oftentimes you hear people say that their community is treated as a sacrifice zone. And so this issue is really important given the fact that Detroit and also other majority Black cities in Michigan and across the Midwest and Northeast are shrinking in population. So shrinking cities could be considered really to be environmental justice issues on their own because of the financial desperation of these cities that also happen to concentrate the less mobile communities that are oftentimes racialized. So it's really, in other words, not a coincidence at all that majority Black and shrinking cities experience environmental justice issues that are oftentimes rationalized by these economic bottom lines. So, for example, it's not a coincidence that Southwest Detroit has the only oil refinery in the state of Michigan. And it's also not a coincidence that Flint continues to experience this tragedy of their water crisis. So I just want to end by saying, mentioning this vulnerable position that these health hazards have placed 48217 in during this pandemic. And not only have these development patterns placed Black Detroiters in their often modest wealth in areas with few vital amenities, things like schools, doctors, but the pollution has also, of course, caused residents to develop a lot of respiratory illnesses and underlying health issues that really place them at some of the highest risk areas if they're to contract COVID-19. And a lot of the residents who I have relationships with in 48217, I've been speaking with throughout this pandemic, and they've really tirelessly worked to create opportunities like these testing sites here you see in this picture, and also to mitigate other issues for their neighbors like hunger, lack of supplies like diapers and other kinds of household goods that become kind of difficult to afford or to come by at this time. And you might also be familiar with some of the mass water shutoffs that have happened in Detroit over the last few years, where households that are behind on their payments, of course, some of the lowest income households in the city have had their water shut off, sometimes for some pretty modest debts, which of course is another symptom of pretty extreme austerity measures in cities. So no running water, of course, presents some real health risks during a pandemic. And 48217 residents have organized together to get their neighbors' water turned back on as well. So just to summarize, this case really illustrates, I think, the way that land use planning and resource allocation, the way we think about budgets, especially in these strained economies, how they can really create environmental racism, and also the ways that the tools of planning, like these plans that I just showed, and the language of planning, can really create this discourse around racialized communities that can sometimes treat them as expendable.
So, Dr. Berkland, thank you so much for your presentation. I find this so insightful. And one of the reasons that we wanted to highlight Dr. Berkland's work here is because positioning this as a case study and looking at an issue like this in a very specific location in depth helps us understand that link between planning and public health that we are so frequently talking about at conferences. And so this is just such a great example of how that really plays out in a very specific neighborhood. With that, I also want to mention that on the program, there are some additional resources, and what Dr. Berkland was talking about really meshes so well with one of the resources. That's an article that was in the Planning magazine called "Racism is a Public Health Crisis: local governments declare. Decades of research confirms what COVID-19 statistics show. Racism is a leading cause of health inequities. How will states and cities respond? So I encourage you to look at some of those additional resources. Dr. Brooklyn, thank you so much. This is just really, really in-depth, very illustrative of what's happening in that community, but also in communities across the United States.
Thank you.
With that, I think we will go ahead and have our first interactive survey. So Ben, if you can pull up the survey, that'd be great.
All right, so in just a second, you're going to see on your screen a question: to what extent do you personally, both as a planner and a resident, see the impacts of redlining in the communities in which you are planning? Option 1 is I see the effects on a daily basis in both my professional and personal life. 2 is I'm aware of the effects. However, as I learn more, I see them more frequently and more clearly. And option 3 is I rarely notice the effects, only when I'm traveling through neighborhoods that don't look like my neighborhood. So the survey is anonymous. So, be truthful, and we'll wrap up in about 10 more seconds. So you should have plenty of time to make your answer. I will do a countdown: 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And now I'm going to display the results. So as you can see, 60% of you are aware of the effects, but as you learn more, you're seeing them more clearly. 33% see the effects on a daily basis, and about 7% do not notice the effects in their community. That's only when they're traveling through different neighborhoods.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And I wanted to mention that Ben and I are looking at the chat for any questions that might come up during the speakers' presentations. So if you have any questions, please send them our way. I didn't see any specific questions come up for Dr. Berglund. I saw a lot of great comments, and so that was really helpful. So if you have any questions, please send them our way. We are going to watch a video now on gentrification. And so if those questions come through, perhaps Dr. Berglund can handle them right after the video. And then during the other presentations, make sure you're sending in your questions, right? So Ben, can you pull up the video, please? This video is on gentrification.
Great.
Gentrification is constantly being talked about. In the past 10 years, the number of Google searches for the word gentrification has more than doubled, and mentions in the news and in literature have gone up. So, people are talking about gentrification, but they often mean different things when they use the term. Gentrification is a process of neighborhood change that includes economic change in a historically disinvested neighborhood by means of real estate investment and new, higher-income residents moving in, as well as demographic change, not only in terms of income level, but also in terms of changes in the education level or racial makeup of residents. Gentrification is complex and needs some explaining. To understand it, there are 3 key things to consider: the historic conditions, especially policies and practices that made communities susceptible to gentrification, the way that central city disinvestment and investment patterns are taking place today as a result of these conditions, and the ways that gentrification impacts communities. Over the last century, many policies and practices have created racialized patterns of disinvestment in city centers that have left low-income communities of color particularly susceptible to gentrification. From the 1930s through the late 60s, standards set by the federal government and carried out by banks explicitly labeled neighborhoods home to predominantly people of color as risky and unfit for investment. This practice, now known as redlining, meant that people of color were denied access to loans that would enable them to buy or repair homes in their neighborhood. Other housing and transportation policies of the mid-20th century fueled the growth of mostly white suburbs and the exodus of capital from urban centers, in a phenomenon often referred to as white flight. Take the GI Bill as an example. The program guaranteed low-cost mortgage loans for returning World War II soldiers. But discrimination limited the extent to which Black veterans were able to purchase homes in the growing suburbs. In fact, the Federal Housing Administration largely required that suburban developers agree to not sell houses to Black people in order for the developers to access these guaranteed loans. Left behind in central city neighborhoods, low-income households and communities of color bore the brunt of highway system expansion and urban renewal programs, which resulted in the mass clearance of homes, businesses, and neighborhood institutions, and set the stage for widespread public and private disinvestment in the decades that followed. In more recent history, the foreclosure crisis also contributed to neighborhood-level vulnerability to gentrification. In low-income communities of color, disproportionate levels of subprime lending resulted in mass foreclosure, leaving those neighborhoods vulnerable to investors seeking to purchase and flip homes in bulk. Today, both people and capital are flooding back into these historically disinvested neighborhoods. One reason new people are moving into these neighborhoods is because of their relative affordability. In many U.S. cities, the rental market has gotten increasingly expensive, and even moderate income earners are on the hunt for lower housing costs. This means that in some places, they are looking in historically disinvested communities, often the same neighborhoods previous generations left behind during the days of white flight. These neighborhoods are often characterized by older historic housing stock that appeals to new residents and close proximity to city centers, where jobs, restaurants, and art spaces are increasingly locating. Cities are also investing in revitalizing some of these neighborhoods, for example with improved transit access and infrastructure, in part to draw in newcomers. On the ground, gentrification may look like real estate speculation, with investors flipping properties for large profits, as well as high-end development, and landlords looking for higher-paying tenants. Increased investment in neighborhood amenities like transit and parks. Changes in land use, for example, from industrial land to restaurants and storefronts. And changes in the character of the neighborhood, as community-run businesses are replaced by businesses catering to new residents' needs. While increased investment in an area can be positive, gentrification is often associated with displacement, which means that in some of these communities, longtime residents are not able to stay to benefit from new investments in housing, healthy food access, or transit infrastructure. Instead, lower-income families, often families of color, may find themselves facing rent increases, evictions, or other displacement pressures, and left with no other choice but to move to suburban or even exurban areas, far away from their jobs and the businesses and service providers they know. This can mean more time commuting, less time spent at home, and increased isolation, depression, and stress levels. For children, displacement can disrupt educational pathways and generate negative health impacts. Even for longtime residents who are able to stay in newly gentrifying areas, changes in the makeup and character of a neighborhood can lead to a reduced sense of belonging or feeling out of place in one's own home. For example, unique cultural vibrancy can be lost as places of worship see their congregants displaced to faraway cities and towns. In addition, family-run businesses and nonprofit organizations may be forced out as their customer base disperses, or as their commercial rents rise past what they can sustain, affecting the ability of those who stay to access the goods and services they need. There might also be changes in neighborhood norms and policing, for example, an increased police presence in order for new residents to feel safe. On the whole, we cannot ignore that the adverse impacts of gentrification, ranging from individual health effects to the suburbanization of poverty, are only the most recent wave in a pattern of urban restructuring that has been imposed upon and negatively affected low-income and communities of color over generations. Public, private, and nonprofit sector leaders have the opportunity to implement strategies that give longtime residents a chance to benefit from increased investment in their communities and even be part of driving how some of the changes in their neighborhoods take place. In order to invest in communities without displacement, policies, programs, and financing tools are needed to protect renters from formal and informal displacement pressures, facilitate the production of more affordable housing, and preserve and upgrade the existing affordable housing stock. Involving community residents in planning and decision-making about their neighborhoods and region can and should be a key piece of all three of these strategies. Taken together, These strategies can help keep communities together so that everyone can enjoy access to improved schools, better food options, more job opportunities, and safer neighborhoods. Qualities we know make cities and regions healthy and vibrant.
Okay, Ben, and one of the reasons that we wanted to include that video is because as planners, we often talk about gentrification, but sometimes we may not be fully aware of the definitions, and the video helps to explain that. And I think within the context of today's presentations, it really does help set the stage for that. I was looking for questions and I didn't see any questions come in for Dr. Berglund. And I know Dr. Berglund is going to have to exit. She's actually up in Canada in a different time zone. We have two speakers joining us from other countries today, Dr. Berglund and Dr. Kofi, who you'll meet a little bit later today. But anyways, thank you again, Dr. Berglund. And if you have any additional questions, if people have questions, you can send them our way and I can forward them to Dr. Berglund separate if that's something that you're interested in. So with that, let's move on to our next speaker. This is going to be Christoph Spieler, and Christoph is going to talk about how racism has shaped public transit. So I was happy to see public transit being addressed in the video, and I think, again, all these things tie really closely together. So take it away, Christoph.
I'm very happy to be here today to talk about a very important topic, which is the overlap of race and transit, something that I have been increasingly paying attention to over my time doing urban planning and being involved in these kind of decisions. I live in Houston. I'm an urban planner at Hewitt-Zollars, where we do all sorts of planning work, including across the country. We've worked in places like Dallas and Fort Worth and Boston and the Twin Cities and El Paso. And I was also a member of the Houston Metro Board for 8 years, the governance board of a large transit system. And I do planning, and I was on a transit board because I love cities. I love the experience of living in cities. I love the way cities bring people together. And as a planner, I am very invested in this idea of I want to make these places better for everybody. And I think that's a very important point because as planners, we come into this world with very good motivations. But we have to understand that the work that we do is not neutral. This is Jay Pitter up in Canada. She says, it either perpetuates or reduces social inequities within cities. And it's very hard for people to wrap their minds around because urbanists are taught that they are good, that they make communities better, and that they are bringers of solutions. And I think we have to recognize as planners and as people who make decisions about cities that we are not always the bringers of solutions. And there are very obvious examples of this. If you look at these houses caught between a freeway and a railroad track, you can see the visual manifestation of this. That white circle shows those houses in the 5th Ward, a historically Black neighborhood in Houston as they existed at the end of World War II. Here's what those houses looked like when the Texas Highway Department bulldozed 2 freeways through that neighborhood. Here's what those houses looked like when those freeways were further widened in the 90s. And the current proposal on the table right now to again rebuild and widen these freeways would wipe these houses out entirely and not even leave any remnant of blocks of what used to be a thriving neighborhood. So those are kind of the physical changes we see, but the impacts are not all physical. Transportation systems impact Black and Hispanic neighborhoods in many different ways. For example, this cancer cluster in Houston caused by a freight rail yard and a creosote tie plant that was active at that rail yard. Or even things like policing, where you realize that a large proportion of the traffic stops in this country are actually part of policing Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. They are not really there for traffic safety. And if you look at the cases we have of people being killed by police, a large number of those cases started with traffic stops. So when we look at transit, transit can absolutely be a tool for making cities more equitable. Transit can absolutely be something that helps everyone access everything that they need in a city. But if we want to get there, we have to realize that transit agencies are still managing and operating systems that have racism embedded in them. Here's an example in Houston. This is the West Belfort Park and Ride out on the southwest side. And if you are sitting here, you have two choices of how to get to downtown Houston. One is a park and ride bus. It will get you there in 30 minutes, thanks to the fact that it operates down barrier separated HOV lanes in the middle of the freeway. So the result of a major investment in public dollars. It has plush seats, it has canopies at every stop. It costs you $3.25 to make that trip, and 60% of the ridership is white. Or you can catch the local bus. It's in mixed traffic. The stops are basic. The seats are hard. It costs you $1.25 and 60% of the ridership is Black. These are two separate parallel networks. And to understand why we have those networks, we have to understand where transit agencies came from. Transit agencies were shaped in the world they were created in, which is the era of the resegregationist response to the civil rights movement. We talk a lot about the civil rights movement. We don't talk nearly as much about what followed. And as the video mentioned, that white flight, that abandonment of the cities as people left the cities in order to move to segregated suburbs. And you ended up with this clear racial segregation between the urban core and the suburbs. Which came along with a lot of other things. That's what came along with the highways that got bulldozed through neighborhoods like the 4th Ward in Houston, in order to allow those suburbs quicker trips into downtown. And this created sort of a way of thinking about cities in which the inner city was seen as declining, it was seen as failing, it was seen as in need of welfare, in need of bailouts, and it was seen as Black. And the suburbs were seen as thriving and growing and in need of infrastructure investment to support that growth, just the way we think about spending money in place and the way we talk about it. And the suburbs were seen as white. And that kind of frame of how people saw cities is the frame that transit agencies were created in. And most transit agencies were really created as a response to two very different problems. Existing transit operations were going bankrupt and highway congestion was increasing. So what transit there was left in the cities, serving a largely low income and heavily minority ridership, was falling apart. And so there was a realization we need to somehow save this. We don't need to make it great, we need to save it. And meanwhile, there was also the realization that those brand new freeways were getting filled up. And we wanted to provide alternatives to being stuck in traffic. Those are two very different asks of a transit agency. And as a result of that kind of dual mandate, many agencies essentially built and operated two different systems with two different standards for amenities, service level of subsidy. It's this whole idea of choice riders versus dependent riders, the way many planners talk about transit, which at first glance may make sense, but I think is actually a deeply problematic idea. As when we think of choice riders, we start having this image in our head of high income, largely white riders who we need to cater to with all sorts of nice amenities. And when we start thinking about choice riders, the image in our heads is these people are going to ride transit anyway. We just need to provide them with transit, and regardless of how good quality that transit is, they're going to ride anyway. And you would see that show up in how transit agencies built their systems. This is an example in Denver where you have the transit agency investing in suburban light rail systems, 8,000 riders a day, 73% of those white. But then you look at a much higher ridership on a corridor in the inner city where there'd actually be a lot more benefit from rail given how many people are riding it. but that instead has a bus and mixed traffic. These decisions about where to invest in infrastructure are very much shaped by that framing of choice riders versus dependent riders, which is a racial framing in this country. And you can see this very obviously in the conditions of an average bus stop in the United States. You can see it in transit agency service standards that, for example, say that commuter rail will be operated so that everybody gets a seat, but on a local bus, it's acceptable if half the people are standing. And beyond this, beyond where agencies invest money, transit agencies concluded that to attract choice riders, they needed to design for what Destiny Thomas calls white comfort. This idea that you need to run your system so that those choice riders are comfortable. And we see this come up all the time when transit gets framed in terms of crime. A suburban area outside of Baltimore wanting to shut down a light rail line because they are saying that criminals from Baltimore are using this train to get to our neighborhood. We know that that statement has racial connotations. And so many transit agencies have actually deliberately designed their systems to separate riders. You see things like here in Philadelphia where you have two rail systems in the same spot charging different fares to get to downtown Philadelphia. These are systems designed for different groups of riders actually operating in parallel. So you can look at a neighborhood or you have commuter rail to Center City and you have an express bus to Center City. Commuter rail has higher fares. It's explicitly operated to be there for higher income white collar commuters, whereas that express bus with a lower fare is being operated to accommodate lower income riders. It's actually an expensive duplication of service to do both of these things, but you can see how these systems were deliberately designed for that separation. You see that in cities where the suburban express buses stop on different streets than the local buses, so riders don't mix at bus stops. You can see it in the form of transit systems like BART in San Francisco, which goes 2.75 miles between stations in one of the densest areas along the entire network, which happens to be a heavily minority inner city neighborhood, while stops are actually much closer together in suburban areas. This is a system that's literally designed so suburban riders can speed right by Black neighborhoods. And transit agencies manage, operate, and police their systems to promote that white comfort. Even as crime in the New York subway was dropping, they were assigning more police officers to patrol that subway, doing things like arresting tamale vendors. If you look at BART stats, 12% of BART riders are Black, 50% of the citations being issued by police, if you look at where that police deployment is. Transit systems have racism built into their schedules, their fleets, their route structure, their infrastructure. And this is not an accident. When you look at transportation or you look at built environment like California's Tamika Butler says here, what you realize very quickly is that these systems were designed exactly how the people in power wanted them designed, and they are working to do that. Agencies have racism built into their government structure. If you look at, for example, the structure of metropolitan planning organizations, it is very typical that the white suburban areas have much higher voting power than the inner cities do. If you look at the structures of transit systems, it is not an accident that the whiter suburban counties in Atlanta created their own transit agencies rather than join MARTA, the transit system which serves the core, which in that region, Atlanta is perceived as Black. So every transit line, every bit of infrastructure, every time we run a bus down the street, that's done in pursuit of a motive. So we should always think about what those motives are. For example, the Cincinnati streetcar built around the idea that streetcars in other cities have been shown to bring new people to an area. They attract people who don't ride buses. They are popular with young professionals who tend to live in and near urban areas. Cincinnati didn't have enough money to actually build a truly useful streetcar. It actually missed connecting the major destinations. The one place it did make it to was a neighborhood called Over the Rhine, a historically Black neighborhood near downtown Cincinnati. This streetcar was explicitly designed to gentrify that neighborhood. And that's not inherent to a streetcar. That's not inherent to steel rails or an articulated vehicle. It is the motive they were designed with. So transit agencies can be powerful tools for equity. If you look at Houston's long-range transit plan, for example, there's rail and BRT that's designed to link Black and Hispanic neighborhoods to universities, to jobs. There's a boost program to improve local bus routes. That park and ride I talked about at the beginning will become a two-way regional service that's actually integrated with local bus, accessibility improvements across the network. We can explicitly make transit more equitable. But to do that, we need more equitable decision-making. We need the leadership of transit agencies to be more equitable, to be more representative of the areas that they serve, and explicitly think about this. We in the transit world have to be more thoughtful about what we do. We can't rely on rules to get there. You've got things like Title VI equity analysis, but that equity analysis is only conducted when service is changed. It does not attempt to analyze existing inequity. So it basically accepts past injustice as a baseline. It's measured the wrong way. It's measured by revenue hours in most agencies rather than quality of service, which means if you put in a bus lane so that bus gets faster and more reliable, it's actually seen as a negative impact, whereas if the bus is stuck in traffic, could actually be seen as a positive impact. So the measurement tools, the rules we use to do this, we can't say, oh, we did a Title VI analysis, we're cool, because often that analysis will actually hide very major flaws. We have to reject, we've always done it that way as an answer. Why doesn't every bus stop have a shelter when every new rail station does? The answer to that isn't, well, that's our standard. The answer isn't, that's what we've done. The answer to that, either there needs to be a good reason for it or we need to not do it. We have to recognize that transit fits into larger systems. Every municipal zoning ordinance is a decision in how many people are able to live next to high quality transit. We have to think of those things together. We have to be willing to call out decision makers. We have to be willing to question their motives. And those of us who are in the consultant and the staff side, if we know something is being done for the wrong reasons, we should say something about that. We have to listen to all of our riders and actually pay attention to the people who experience these networks and how they impact their day-to-day lives. And most of all, we have to all be willing to talk about race. This is not something we can leave to only the people who are negatively affected by it. We as planners have a responsibility to be honest about this. And with that, I'll mention my book, Trains, Buses, People, an Opinionated Atlas of US Transit. I'm also quite active on Twitter. But if you are on Twitter, I would highly encourage you to follow Jay Pitter, Tamika Butler, and Destiny Thomas. They are all doing some excellent work out there that has really shaped how I can think about these issues and that I think is very worth paying attention to. With that, I'm happy to answer some questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Christoph. That was an excellent presentation. And just by looking at all the comments in the chat, it was very provocative and it looks like you got a lot of really great comments. I'm gonna let Ben look through those comments to see if there's anything that came out as a question. But while Ben looks through the thread, what I wanted to mention is that under the additional resources section of the program, some of the names that Christoph mentioned, there are people who wrote articles and some of those articles are listed in those resource sections. And one that I wanted to point out in particular is the third bullet point. It's What Transit Agencies Get Wrong About Equity and How to Get It Right by Mary Buchanan and Natalie Rivera. And that one actually talks very specifically about Title VI and what it is that we do as transit planners. Remember, I am a transit planner. And so often we talk about integration of land use and transportation, and this is such a great presentation through which to view that. And this particular article really gets into that issue of the Title VI equity analysis into a little bit more depth. So for those transportation planners that are out there, feel free to take a look at these resources a little bit more closely. Ben, were there any comments that you wanted to call out that were particular questions for Christoph? And maybe Christoph, you've had a chance to look at that thread as well, and maybe you want to add a couple of remarks and close out this section.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I noticed one question here where Michael Brady says BART was designed as a suburban commuter rail line in the 1950s to 60s, in part to reduce the number of expensive freeway lanes that would otherwise be needed. They originally didn't have handrails for standees. They were surprised when people used it in large numbers in central city areas. How should that be changed now 50 years later? So the first thing I would say is I actually give great kudos to the current BART board on not continuing that suburban expansion, on actually questioning, should we be focusing our resources on moving outwards and actually focusing on capacity in the core. I mean, the problem is when we build infrastructure, it is really hard to change. I mean, I think BART has some spots where infill stations would make an awful lot of sense, but it's very hard to do once you're running a system already. So sometimes it's a lot of little things, sometimes it's some big moves. Sometimes it may be saying we need to think about those neighborhoods and make some major new investments in them. Sometimes it may be, let's change fare policy. I would love to see it if BART fares were integrated with bus fares so that you could get on AC Transit and jump from AC Transit to BART and cost the same. And I would love to see, obviously, the kind of policing we're seeing there. I would love to see BART being a place that feels more welcoming to everybody. And obviously, we can think about things like, how do you enable more people to live next to the transit we have? Can we build affordable housing that is actually well located on high quality transit? And how do we prevent cities from blocking that housing?
Well, all excellent comments, excellent thread, and thank you so much, Christoph. We really want to thank you for your perspectives. I think this has been very thought-provoking for many people on today's workshop. Let's go ahead and go into our interactive survey number 2. So Ben, if you can pull that up, please.
All right, here it comes. And I'm going to give a little more time on this one. I got some feedback that I rushed some of you on the first one. So this survey, to what extent do policies in your current plans comprehensively address public health, equity, housing, and climate change? Option 1 is we're ahead of the curve. Plans and policies in my community address these 4 issues proactively. Option 2 is we are making progress, although not on all 4 topics simultaneously. Option 3 is dismally. In my community, we need massive work to begin to address these questions. So just gonna wait for maybe 20 or 30 more seconds and let the results come in. Looks like most of you have voted. I'm gonna call 10 more seconds. So 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And there we go. So here's the results for interactive survey number 2. We see the bulk of participants, 61%, are making some progress, although not on all 4 topics simultaneously. 36% of you responded dismally. In my community, we need massive work to begin to address these issues. Stay tuned for the rest of this discussion. And 3% of you did say we're ahead of the curve. Plans and policies in my community address these 4 issues proactively. So that concludes our poll, and back to you, Carolina.
Okay. Well, those are very interesting results. And I think based on this, we are so open to learning more and having conversations. So with that, we're going to go into our first breakout discussion. And we will spend about 10 to 12 minutes. We're running a little bit behind schedule. And what we're going to do is Ben is going to randomly assign you about 7 to 8 people per group. And then you will have a chance to discuss amongst yourself. And we've proposed the question to focus on is, how has the information presented so far affected how you think about systemic racism and inequity? What we have found is that when people have a chance to talk amongst themselves, it can be really helpful to that learning process. So we'd encourage you to turn your cameras on so that you can be seen and to engage in dialogue. And we really look forward to your participation in these dialogues. After that, we'll come back, we'll take a break, and then we will start back up at 12:50. Okay, so Ben, if you can assign us our breakouts, that would be great.
Okay, here we go. And just a second. All right, there we go.
All right, it looks like everyone is coming back. I don't know about you all, but my group was fantastic. Really good in-depth conversation. So now what we're going to do is take a break. We will break until 12:50. I encourage you not to leave, just to turn off your volume and your camera and then rejoin us at 12:50 so that we can get into the actionable steps for planners. So thanks so much. Enjoy your break and we'll see you at 12:50. Hi, everyone. It is 12:50 and it's good to see people coming back on. We are hoping that most everyone stays for the second portion of today's workshop. And I see that Maru also is on. She was we had to have Julia speak in her place. Hi, Maru. But she's now back on, so that's really good. Maru, if you are still on at the end, we'll have you make some closing remarks potentially. And we'll see how that goes. And let's see here. So I'm seeing some people's cameras come back on, and that's really good. We'll give it maybe one more minute and then we will go ahead and proceed with our next speaker. So I'm hoping that everybody is having a nice Friday, and I really appreciate everyone spending so much time with us and investing in this workshop, to help further our planning careers. We're really so happy to have everyone. This has just been really fantastic turnout and just really excellent conversations. All right. I'm going to assume that people who don't have their cameras or their videos on are back. And maybe they're just munching on a sandwich or something. And so with that, I would like to get started on the second part. So we are heading into Equity 102. Where do we go from here? Actionable steps for planners. And this is really where we're getting into the section where we want to make it as relevant as possible for our fellow planners in the profession. And so I'd like to next introduce Desiree Powell. Desiree is in Houston, and she is going to talk to us about diversity and inclusiveness in the workforce. You will see that Desiree wrote an article, and that was featured in the Planning magazine. And so the first resource under additional resources is a link to her article. And I was so impressed by this article that I reached out to her, and she agreed to speak at our workshop. And so we're so pleased to have you, Desiree. It's all yours.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm actually from Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Okay, sorry about that.
It's okay. Texas is Texas. Again, thank you for inviting me and for having me. I know I'm one of probably the few people that aren't in this section or even in California. So I definitely appreciate the little space invasion for the day. Yeah, I was in your breakout group. I didn't say a lot, sorry. But I wanted I guess, my session to be more interactive-ish in the sense of when you talk about inclusiveness and equity and diversity in the workplace, you can't really show a slide. I mean, you can, but it kind of falls back into everything that we've done up until now. We go to workshops, we go to seminars, we go to half-day conferences to be like sensitivity training. You can't really train someone to be a decent human being. So I just wanted to have like a very open and, I guess one-on-one or one-on 59 conversation. So basically, like Carolina mentioned, my article was in the planning magazine. They reached out to me a couple months back, and I just kind of went out on a limb and accepted it, not really knowing how it was gonna go. And I guess the reception of it was pretty well, in the sense of equity is more than just putting equitable design in front of a plan or using it as a buzzword, as a hot word, as a keyword. And that's something that I've seen a lot, and you probably can attest to the same, that you see it a lot in your cities, you see it a lot when people are submitting RFPs and RFQs, that they're gonna have the most equitable design, and then on the ground it's just same old, and they fight you tooth and nail while they have to have a pedestrian walkway kind of thing. So another one of the resources that Carolina put in there was the Voices of Equity at APA. I recommend, if you have a minute, whenever, to go check it out. There's a couple of my colleagues in that. They're talking about APA from different lenses. And the main thing that I wanted to talk about was, when people talk about inclusiveness and equity, they interchange them. And to me, at least from this lens of a Black female planner in Texas in a white male dominant profession, you can't interchange equity and inclusiveness, or diversity and inclusiveness, because to be diverse does not mean to be inclusive. And we recently started this leadership team in the city that I work in Texas, shared leadership, where, we're talking about, is our city diverse and is our city inclusive? Our city demographic is very diverse as far as Black, Hispanic, Vietnamese, Arabic, everything, you name it. Is it inclusive as far as a city employee? Not really. There's only one other person that looks like me in my department as far as a male, or two other people. I'm fortunate that my immediate boss is a female. She's the first one to ever have that position. But as far as inclusive, do we have these conversations that are uncomfortable, that makes everybody feel uncomfortable? Or is it just to appease, we don't want to talk about police reform around the police department because, it could get touchy, or we don't want to talk about things that are happening, social justice issues with, again, the police department, because it could step on people's toes. In that sense, your department really isn't inclusive, because you can't talk about it without it becoming like an argument. And it should always be a discussion. Like she mentioned at the very beginning, it's about education. Some people can be educated, some people just want to be ignorant. And, it is what it is on that tip. But as far as in the workplace, to be equitable is, in a sense, giving everybody a chance to sit at the table, which is totally fine. As we're seeing the things of planning and the racism and the context and everything kind of unravel and unfold, you see people say, well, we tried to invite them out. We tried to give them a seat at the table. We tried to engage them as best as possible with flyers in one language. If they're in a neighborhood that English isn't the primary language, or having meetings in the afternoon when most people work a job and they don't get off till 5 or 6. So that's typical public engagement of, we tried to give them a seat, and we tried to do the equitable thing. Whereas when you're inclusive, you get out there and you kind of beat the pavement. You meet people where they are. You come to them in a way that isn't obtrusive or invasive, but you have meetings at 7 if you have to. You have meetings at 7:30 if you need to. Even now, with everything being virtual, I think it creates a lot more room for growth as far as how we interact with people. Every single person probably has a cell phone. So there's just so many ways to interact with people beyond just, emails and Zooms. And just because me as a planner prefer emails, I imagine if I had to do a public meeting to my grandma who's 76, would she want to get an email? Probably not. So it's more so you have to know your audience. You kind of got, read the room to see, okay, we're doing the virtual thing, but how can you make sure that everybody still is there? To me, equity in the workforce kind of forces you to code switch, quote unquote. And if you are a planner of color, then you probably have heard that terminology in the sense of, you can't talk about X, Y, and Z because they may think of you differently, even though that's the person that you are outside of work. Me personally now, and even a little bit before, exist 100%, authentically Black at work, in the sense of, if people talk about police reform or why they don't like it or Blue Lives Matter, it doesn't, it's not going to change me coming into work every day. It's just like, okay, that's a conversation that I don't feel like, that's a gaslighting situation and I don't want to be a part of it. But also, you shouldn't have to dim your light when you're at your job. You shouldn't have to pretend like you can't speak 2 languages or 3 languages, or that, you do, when somebody comes in, you do talk about that. Oh yeah, so code switching is basically where people say you talk white, you talk like very proper, you use a lot of grammar, you use complete sentences. If you're a person of color, then it's something that you've probably experienced in some form or another, especially in a hierarchy situation. They kind of make you feel like you think you're better than us. And that can create issues and tension in a workplace environment, in the sense of, it's not that, that's just how you talk. But after a while, you're almost living in 2 lives, or living in 2 worlds. You're living in your work voice, and then you're living in your at-home voice. And after a while, it's kind of like, okay, who am I? And as we grow and as things change, it's kind of like, of course, everything you do at home, you don't want to bring to work, but the way you interact with people, the things that you talk about, whether it's police reform, education reform, women's rights, feminism, those are things that shouldn't just be, I talk with my friends at the bar, but now I can talk about with my coworkers, because if they're planners too, it should also be on their list of not even things to do, but things to think about, in the sense of, okay, how can we make this better? How can we foster change for this? Instead of, that doesn't need to be in the workplace, even though most of us know by now planning touches pretty much every aspect of day-to-day life, from work, school, home, the cars we drive, the streets we ride on, the streets we walk on, the restaurants we visit, everything. So there's really no more silos of, okay, well, that's not meant for the workplace when it comes to public health and quality of life. So I want to, she's right, it's very integral to everyday life. Planning is something that is almost like second nature to people if they knew that it existed. So as it ties back into the workforce with equity, to me, that's one of the things of, you don't want it to seem like you were just given the opportunity because you are a woman and they're trying to meet a quota and they're trying to, quote unquote, check a box. You want to earn it. You worked hard for it. The fact that you're the first woman or first person of color in that position is just a bonus. It shouldn't be a matter of, okay, well, we're going to check our equity box and make sure that he or she gets this position because we don't have enough people of color in leadership. You want to feel included, hence inclusiveness, in the sense of, okay, I'm in this position, but everything that they said they were going to let me do, nothing's happening. I don't have a voice. We can't talk about anything. Like there's no real room for me to grow and be myself. In that sense, you were given a seat at the table just to feel good about yourself, not necessarily given a seat at the table to maybe overthrow the table and or create a new table. That's where I feel like we as planners and we as a whole, and at least in my city in Texas, you hear people use interchange equity and inclusive as if, okay, we check the equity box, so that must mean that we're inclusive and or diverse, which isn't always the case. For the most part, a city that prides itself on being equitable and doing equitable designs and equitable plans probably is lacking pretty heavily in inclusiveness and true diversity, for the fact that inclusiveness is not just including Black and brown people, it's including people who are Vietnamese, who are Arabic, people with disabilities, people Braille, sign language. It's more than just the color of my skin. It's also, if you meet with someone like right now with Zoom, people that may not be tech savvy, they don't have access to the internet, or people that are hard of hearing. There's not a lot of functions on Zoom that can really help you with that if they don't know how to use the keyboard. So it's inclusiveness, it definitely goes beyond just skin color. It goes beyond race. And sometimes I think people gaslight the situation and the conversation to make it seem like, well, it's always about race. Unfortunately, as a person of color, as a female of color, you have to look at it in the lens of you're fighting an uphill battle. I'm not saying that it's not worth it, but it's something that you just have as not a chip on your shoulder, but a win in your pocket, because it's an experience that no one else that doesn't look like you can really talk about. But at the same time, being able to have people feel included at work, I would say I feel included at work based on the way my boss treats me, because she is a woman, not a Black woman, but still a woman who is really big on that. if I say I went upstairs to city management, would I feel included? Probably not. They're gonna ask me something, but they're not even gonna take my consideration. They're just gonna be like, oh, well, you work on the bottom floor, so that's that. So that's, to me, that's where the biggest overlapping is, as far as equity in your workplace and opposed to inclusiveness in your workplace. When you're included in something, you have a voice, you have a say-so, you get to raise your hand or just talk out of turn like anyone else could. When you're invited to the conversation from an equity standpoint, you're here, but you're here just to fill a space. You're here to, look good on paper, but don't say anything, kind of thing. So I'm definitely open to the conversation and the dialogue. I feel like I've talked way too much, so.
Well, I think this is great. I'm not seeing questions per se come up in the chat, but I do think that it would be really worthwhile, Desiree, for people to hear about your firm and why you named it, and how you feel about the direction that it's going in.
So I started what was initially just like a blog, called Black Spaces, without the A. And I had done a lot of research on, sorry, that was the timer for myself. I had done research on another organization called Black Space, and they run as a nonprofit. They go to different states all over the US, and they pretty much help revitalize communities. Unfortunately, when I hear the word revitalize, I think of urban renewal. So I didn't want to take the same route. Black Spaces was really just created as a place to exist as not even a Black planner at the time, just a Black person with everything that was going on. It was a way for me, myself, to be more proactive and less reactive to not just the events that happened in 2020, but the way and the communities that I've had in my 29 years of life. Yeah, 29. And it's just kind of grown, and it created this collective called the Black Planner Collective, where we just had a Zoom call. I just had a Zoom call, and all these people showed up that were Black, and they were either they're planners, they're designers, they're architects, they're realtors, they're like filmmakers. And it's just a space where Black people in the design profession or the development profession can just be themselves. There's no code switching. There's no, you have to talk a certain way. You can talk about the frustrations you have with planning. You can talk about the frustrations you may have at your job. And for a lot of people that I've met through that space, a lot of them are the only Black person or person of color at their job. So people don't understand when they say, well, we don't want to go on that street. We don't want to go on that side of town for lunch today, that it's creating a microaggression. As it grows, the calls they get bigger somehow. And it's now I'm trying to craft it in a way that it's inclusive of students. In the time that it's been, I guess, a thing since like April, I've had a lot of students reach out to me that they're in a program that they don't have hardly or any representation. So they feel not only terrified of like finding a job in the current economic situation, but also finding a job and having to deal with what's going on the road around you, and as a huge microaggression, and then as a microaggression at your job. Like, they're terrified of not having any Black coworkers. The design part of it just came from, I'm super interested in placemaking and space activation. And because I'm a millennial and I don't like to follow rules, it's like the next phase of my career after, I leave like the public sector. It gives me the ability to be present in Black and brown communities where space activation is just a buzzword. It's just like a special event for the weekend. It's not long-term, it's not sustainable. If like our state fair here is huge, and we didn't have it this year, but it creates a lot of jobs for like less than a month, and then it goes away, and then people's livelihood go away. So I'm really interested in how things like that can happen, be ran well, sometimes bending some rules, but can create sustainable and long-term jobs, investment, and then just that aspect of generational wealth that we kind of missed out on.
Desiree, this is so great. And I noticed that there are 2 questions that came up in the chat that would be helpful. The first one is from Eric, and he asks, how do you have that conversation with friends and colleagues to explain that you as white do not have the same experiences of those of color? So I think that's a really good question, because in the workforce in particular, that's maybe a different kind of conversation, or approaching the conversation might be done in a different way. Mm-hmm. And then Dorothy asks, and she's curious, what thoughts might you have on how to create more inclusive and diverse spaces in planning? She says that she thinks there's a big disconnect between planners' demographics and communities' demographics. Your thoughts on that?
So for the first question, I have been very grateful and very blessed to have interacted with a ton of different people throughout my planning career and also just like life playing basketball and the sports. And then some of my closest friends from school are white and Black. But I also was in a program that I didn't have any teachers that looked like me. I had a lot of teachers that were international and they're super smart, super educated, great people. But they can sit down and have that conversation of, I understand, I don't know, but I can at least talk to you about it. It's kind of like when the big thing came up with the color of law. We can talk about it, but do you really understand it? In order to comprehend, you have to listen. And if you want to engage that conversation as a white coworker or as a white colleague or friend, the best thing for you to do is not to come at it like you've had that same experience, especially if you feel like you haven't. You come at it in the sense of, hey, honestly, I get it. I mean, I don't get it. I know that it's bad. I know that it's wrong. And, you know, maybe I've said X, Y, and Z in the past. I've heard people say it and I haven't corrected them. So how do I move forward? It doesn't have to be a hard conversation. I just think it's one that not a lot of people want to have because it puts people's insecurities on the spotlight in the sense of, I'm not racist, but man, I never really thought about it in the way of beyond maybe what I was taught in school or what I know or some of the Black friends that I have or people that I know. So I would say, I mean, you have it. Just if you're friends with someone, it shouldn't be a hard conversation to have. It definitely should be one that you can sit down over dinner, over drinks, or Zoom and have that conversation in the sense of, I just want to understand. I want to know better. I know Google exists and I know I can educate myself, but as you know, history says, the best teacher is someone who's lived it. So you just engage it as if it's not like, you're not putting them on a spectacle to be like a lab experiment. Like, let me study XYZ about being Black. You talk to them as if they were going to talk to you about your white experience if you maybe work in a predominantly Black city and you feel like, I never know what's going on. I can never associate with that community.
You know, that's so great. It's so great. And we're going to have to wrap up on this section, but I did want to point out a little bit more in the chat. Courtney asked how many of our workplaces might have ways for people to organize and connect with one another. And then Celeste talked about agency attitude changes and equity and inclusion should start at the executive level. But if it doesn't, then staff can take the effort on, and her planning department created a Teams group where they can discuss and share resources. And she has a link there. And the Thrivance group now has come up a couple of times. And I think that that's really a tremendous resource. Desiree, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your insights. Thank you.
And having this open format like this was great. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
And keep those articles and the blogs coming because as planners, when we see them, I think they're very impactful for us.
Thank you. I appreciate it for sure. And thank you guys for listening and sitting here.
Thank you. All right. The next presentation we have, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about what a specific city has done. And we looked at Portland as a case study, the systematic approach through racial equity goals and strategies. And so now I'd like to introduce Dr. Kofi Deso, and he is actually in Africa right now. So he is our most international and far away guest. We're so pleased to have him. He is the Deputy Director of Portland's Office of Equity and Human Rights. And so with that, Dr. Deso, welcome. And we hope that the time difference isn't too big for you.
No, thank you so much. It is almost 8 p.m. here in Lomé, Togo. Yeah, in fact, it's 8:12. Thank you for having me. This is a great opportunity for me to share the City of Portland's systematic approach to achieving equity through racial equity goals and strategies. I will also share with you some commitment that the city government took in support to the racial equity goals and strategies, because the goals included some strategies, and in complying with that racial equity goals and strategies as a binding policy, we continued supporting the department through the creation of some frameworks, the capacity building, and so on. So the city of Portland created the Office of Equity and Human Rights in 2011, and we opened our doors in 2012, March 2012. I was part of this first team that started the office, and I was the one who created the Racial Equity 101, the training that became a mandatory training for all city employees. And later, I participated in some work groups to help the department create their racial equity plans, 5-year equity plans. And then we collectively created racial equity goals and strategies that the city government adopted in 2015. So the goals, there are three main goals. The goal number one, it says we will end disparities within city government so there is fairness in hiring, promotions, greater opportunity in contracting, and equitable services to all residents. The goal number two says we will strengthen outreach, public engagement, and access to city services for communities of color and immigrant and refugees communities, and support or change existing services using racial equity best practices. The goal number three says we will collaborate with communities and institutions to eliminate racial inequity in all areas of government, including education, criminal justice, environmental justice, health, housing, transportation, and economic success. After the passing the resolutions to adopt the racial equity goals and strategies as a binding policy, the Office of Equity and Human Rights was charged with providing support, technical support, education to all the city employees, including elected officials. So another commitment from the city government was the adoption of the racial equity-centered result-based accountability. It's a framework. So one of the strategies of the equity goals and strategies is to provide an equity framework. So we considered the racial equity-centered result-based accountability as one of the framework that we brought to the city of Portland to build capacity, train some key managers, and including the elected officials and the director of department, to learn about the framework and implement the framework into their strategic planning, implementation, and performance measures. So, recently, and through the training, the capacity building around the result-based accountability, the cohort that participated in the training came up with a lot of recommendations for the city government, asking the government to adopt a city shared core values. The city had core values before, but they wanted the city to update the core values. And in June 2020, the city of Portland adopted new core values that include anti-racism, equity, transparency, communication, collaboration, and fiscal responsibility. So the new things in the new core values are anti-racism and equity. So the city government said that these values inform a unified workforce and city culture, systems, planning, policies, practices, and procedures. So all the departments are now integrating those values that I consider also principles, because moving beyond the value statement to make them principles and integrate them in everything that we do. That was the spirit of these new core values. So I work with almost all the departments within the city of Portland to integrate the core values into everything, including planning. Even last night, about this time, I was having a session with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. It is a team that was working on anti-displacement. So the team wants me to guide them in the use of the root cause analysis to really come up with the best strategies to really implement the anti-displacement resolutions. So this is to tell you that that's one example of how the city is systematically integrating anti-racism values and principles and equity into everything that we do. And I work with the Bureau, the Budget Office in integrating the result-based accountability, anti-racism in budgeting and performance measures. This morning, I had a meeting with the training manager in the HR department because she's developing a leadership engagement training for managers and supervisors. And I'm working with them to make sure that we integrate these core values as well as the result-based accountability framework into the leadership training for managers and supervisors. I work with the city auditor service, the auditor office, to support them in using the result-based accountability in audit services. So these are some examples that I want to give you that the city government, the city of Portland, is using to systematically integrate, anti-racism values, racial equity principles into policies, planning, policies, practices, resource allocation, evaluation, and performance measures. I'm going to stop here and maybe you have some questions for me.
Dr. Dessou, thank you so much for this presentation. One of the things that I just wanted to point out is that on the program, we provided links to what the city of Portland is doing. And in reviewing those links, it's just been so impressive because it is truly a citywide effort. And Dr. Dessou talked about that. One of the things I was really impressed with was if you go to the link that shows the citywide racial equity goals and strategies, they've really simplified it to 3 equity goals and 6 equity strategies. And the goals are very clear and concise. End racial disparities within city government, strengthen outreach, public engagement, and access to city services for communities of color, and collaborate with communities and institutions to eliminate racial inequity in all areas of government. And then these strategies, and Dr. Dessou talked about them. The other thing that I think is just so impressive with this particular effort is that the city has made it very clear. They have put on their website the history of what has happened over time. They've put the redlining maps onto the website and talked about it. They've looked at the different plans that they put in place and done an analysis and looked at what maybe was inequitable or wasn't really the way that potentially it should have been done to have been as equitable as possible. And so they've been really forthcoming about all of that, and then putting in this office and then getting people like Dr. Dessou and others that are experts and so passionate to work on all of these issues. I think this is just really a fantastic example. And I just want to commend you for your work and thank you for being here to showcase what's happening in Portland. It looks like a couple of questions have come in. So from Vicki, she says, thank you so much, Dr. Dessou. Can you talk a bit about how Portland City leadership were convinced to undertake the racial equity efforts And in addition to that, so talking about how leadership was convinced to undertake the racial equity efforts, it looks like there's another question from Dorothy, and that one's about results-based performance, what that looks like tangibly to a staff member and how that relates to tangible equity results for residents.
Great. So I'm going to begin with the first one, how city government or city council was convinced. The demands came from the community. It started with showing how the city is doing. There were some reports from Urban League Portland and the Coalition of Communities of Color. They contracted with Portland State University. So they showed in the reports that although the city of Portland was doing well economically, people of color were doing worse than 25 years ago. So the council was shocked by that report, and they decided to do something, doing something. So they committed to initiate a racial equity program. When they were developing the Portland, the 25-year plan for Portland, they included a framework for equity, and they asked the new structure to center race in this framework for equity. So again, the demand came from the community, and the communities are organized and continue to put pressure on the government. And so I think that was the significant way that the city government was convinced. Staff could not convince them, but the community was able to do that. Okay, how does result-based performance look like tangibly for a staff person? In the result-based accountability framework, one key question we ask is, who is better off? You can have, great input, output, quality work, but the last question we should ask is, who is better off? So if any staff person, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color on the workforce are not better off, that means the result is not positive. So that means there is disparity. So we have a dashboard, a workforce demographic dashboard on our website. We work with HR and the technology services to show the demographics of the workforce. That's one result that we can say, okay, this percentage of employees are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And then we also look at the management level, mid-management level, upper management level, even elected offices. Those are some indicators to show that, okay, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are better off in terms of the workforce. And there is research that shows that, when the workforce represents the demographics of the city, it is more likely that the services to the residents will also be improved, because these people are representing, they understand their communities, they help the city government to better serve those communities. And the COVID-19 gave us a good example. The city and the county government changed their approach to community engagement. They work closely with community-based organizations, but also identify the people within the workforce that have connections with the community-based organizations to guide them on how to better serve their communities. And it has shown that communities that did never have any connection, any engagement with the city government now have direct engagement with the city government by receiving direct services and support. So again, the demographics is one indicator that, okay, people are better off, but also the morale of the workforce. If you conduct a survey with employees to show how they are doing, how they are feeling, they will tell you. The HR and other departments have collected data from staff, And they learned a lot, and they are developing strategies to address what they have found.
So these comments have been so terrific. It looks like we have another question from, or a comment from Dorothy. Really interesting survey regarding demographics of a city versus equitable service delivery. It's intuitive, but it's great the city has data on that. Thank you, Dr. DeSue. So thank you for the perspectives and for helping us understand what's happening in Portland. Another resource that I wanted to point out that is related to this, and this is listed in the additional resources section, is the Local and Regional Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And they're also, the acronym is GARE. And the website is listed as www.racialequityalliance.org. I recently listened into a webinar that was hosted by GARE, and it was really excellent. And I think what Portland is doing, and if I'm not mistaken, Portland did work with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. So it's a great tool and a great organization for governments that are participating on this call to look into if you are wanting to put an equity program together. And as Portland has done, is make it citywide. So it's not just one department or two departments, but rather across the city. And I think that's where we're seeing the effectiveness that Dr. DeSue is talking about. So keep up the excellent work. Thank you so much for informing us of everything that's happening. Really, truly a model to look at. And thank you for joining us again, all the way from Africa, even in a different time zone. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so next we are going to have another breakout discussion. And what we would like to do at this breakout discussion is take a moment to reflect upon the actionable steps that we've discussed so far. After the breakout, we're going to have a couple of more items. We're going to have a video about addressing displacement. So earlier we had a video about gentrification, and it helped us identify and define what that was. This next video is going to talk about addressing displacement, some modern day solutions. And I think that that will tie in very nicely to the final speaker that we'll have after that, which will be Arlen Benavides. And he is going to talk about addressing equity through general plans and zoning codes. And then we'll have one more breakout discussion. So while we're only about halfway through Equity 102, I think it's worthwhile to take a moment to talk a little bit about what we've heard from Desiree, as well as from Dr. DeSue, and talk about, again, these are more focused on how do we bring more diversity and equity and inclusiveness into the workforce itself and into the profession, and into how we are working with consultants and our teams. And then potentially, what do we think about a more systematic approach across our cities? And then we're going to get more into the specifics about the general plans and SB 1000. All right, so Ben, if you can split us into our random breakout discussion sessions, we will go ahead and talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will bring everyone back right around 1:50. Okay, thank you. Hey, looks like people are starting to come back in. It's great to see so many faces. This is really fantastic. I hope you all had really good conversations. I know in my group, I got to see old friends and have meaningful conversations, and that's always very nice. So let's go ahead and jump right back in, because we're a little bit limited with time. So the next thing that we have is a video. And as we talked about before, this next video is going to address displacement and modern day solutions. And this was a video that has been put together by the San Francisco Fed and Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley and the San Francisco Foundation. And so let's go ahead and show this, and we'll go from here.
A typical American moves over 11 times in their lifetime. Mobility is part of the American experience and can signify exciting changes. But sometimes people are forced to move against their will. This can take different forms: an eviction, an extreme rent increase, foreclosure on a property owner, or even demolition of a home. These types of moves are displacement, and they disrupt people's lives. In some cases, displacement can leave people without any other housing options. They may find themselves living in shelters, cars, or on the street. One of the most commonly talked about forms of displacement is eviction. Millions of Americans are evicted every year, and evictions are beginning to be recognized as a national epidemic. Some groups are more likely to experience evictions and displacement than others. For example, a study in Milwaukee revealed that 8% of white renters experienced evictions, compared to 15% of Black renters and 29% of Hispanic renters. And on the whole, low-income households are particularly vulnerable to evictions. But evictions are not the only way displacement happens. Often referred to as soft evictions, landlords may put pressure on tenants to move by engaging in harassment, cutting off utilities, removing parking, ignoring requests to fix appliances, or failing to address other substandard conditions that threaten the health and safety of tenants. Extreme rent increases are another means of displacement. When rent is suddenly increased past what a family can afford, they're left with no choice but to leave their home. Even moves that seem voluntary may in fact be displacement when you look under the surface. For example, it is displacement when a young adult wants to move out of their parents' home, but has their options constrained by prohibitively expensive housing. They may be faced with a choice between staying put or moving out of their neighborhood altogether. When a family has to find a new home or has to move outside of their community, they may find themselves far away from their families and friends and possibly from their jobs and key service providers. This can lead to increased stress and even depression, impacting parents and their ability to support their families. Displacement pressures hit economically unstable families the hardest. When low-income households have to leave their homes, they often move to even lower-income neighborhoods. These kinds of moves can affect life chances, as neighborhood conditions can have lasting impacts on health, educational outcomes, and earnings potential. For one, studies show that your zip code is actually more important than your genetic code in determining life expectancy. And living in a high-poverty, under-resourced neighborhood has been shown to lower children's test scores and their earnings in adulthood. So while displacement is often seen as the effect of poverty, displacement to worse-off neighborhoods can actually intensify poverty conditions and inhibit economic mobility, leading to a vicious cycle. Regardless of the type of neighborhood a displaced family moves into, forced moves can have especially negative consequences for children. Kids often switch schools due to displacement, which is disruptive to their education. And even when they don't change schools, studies show that moving around can negatively affect their academic performance. Children's health can also be affected by displacement. Research has shown that children who move more often show higher levels of behavioral and emotional problems, increased teenage pregnancy rates, and increased adolescent depression. Taking a step back, it's critical to consider how displacement affects not just individuals and families, but also whole communities. Residents who live far away from other members of their community may have less political power as voting blocs are diluted and communities become less organized, weakening their ability to advocate for needed changes. Displacement is complex, and there is no one-size-fits-all for ending it. However, there are some important initiatives towards slowing it down. Multifaceted solutions are needed that protect renters, facilitate the production of more affordable housing, and preserve existing affordable housing stock. Involving the community in planning and organizing residents can be a key piece of all three of these strategies. And this means more opportunities for residents to live stable, happy, and healthy lives.
Okay, so interesting video, lots of really good information. And I think for those of us who don't think about displacement very frequently, it helps to give us an idea of the impacts of displacement on the families that we work with. So now what we're going to do is we are going to go into our final speaker. And I'm really pleased to introduce Arlen Benavides. Arlen is here locally from the Central region. We're just so excited to have him be able to speak because he had been working with the city of Tulare and working on their general plan update and trying to incorporate SB 1000. And so he's going to speak from personal experience and integrate what do we look for when we're updating our general plan? How can we work in SB 1000 and the public participation aspect of that? So with that, Arlen, welcome.
Thank you, Carolina. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. I know that we've been listening to a lot of heavy topics and a lot of the inequities that exist in many of our communities. So if it's all right with you, I would just like to take a second for some mindfulness. If everyone would like to sit up straight and then take a deep breath and let go. And then we're going to do 2 more. One more. All right. Thank you. I just want to appreciate you all for being here. I know that these are all very important topics that we've been discussing. And I think you all should be very appreciative of yourselves for taking this information because I trust, and I know that you trust too, that you will apply it to the best of your abilities to address some of the inequities that exist where you live and the communities that you're serving. So as Carolina mentioned, I recently completed my fellowship with Civic Spark, and Civic Spark is a governor's initiative program, and it's through the Local Government Commission, which is a partnership with the state through the office or the Governor's Office of Planning and Research and California Volunteer. And I assisted the County of Tulare in developing their EJ element and starting from the ground up, working on the research, the data collection, and the civic engagement. So we were looking to address all of the requirements of SB 1000 as well as the Assembly Bill 1628, which is really focused on the community outreach component of environmental justice. I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation and start share. And then I'm going to pull this up. Slideshow. All right, so I already introduced myself, and I wanted to start with the definition of environmental justice. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people of all races, cultures, incomes, and national origins with respect to the development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And I think this is in theme with a lot of the discussions that we've been having about having that meaningful involvement with community members, because as Dr. Lisa Berglund mentioned, a lot of these communities that we're trying to understand feel like they're not being heard, feel like they've been neglected, or have been forgotten. So environmental justice, I want to talk about what it really means, because I've been in community meetings with community residents, and they have always mentioned to me, what do I mean by environmental justice and what that should mean to them? And I think the importance of highlighting what environmental justice means to communities is that unlike other planning that has taken place in a jurisdiction, and when I say jurisdiction, I mean county or city, environmental justice is truly listening to community members. It is about involving them in the process, because as many community members will communicate to you all, they have been going to meetings for years, for months. They feel like they have communicated what their needs are, what their challenges they're facing in their communities are, and yet they don't see any of that language. They don't hear their voices in our plans that we're writing as city planners. And so what environmental justice is not just looking at the environmental hazards that are located in or near disadvantaged communities that are creating these adverse effects. And it's not only addressing affordability or other topics that we'll be discussing later in this presentation, but it's about recognizing the community and making sure that their voices are in the general plan. So environmental justice includes both A through D. And like I mentioned, it's the availability of a healthy environment for all people. So we know that for people to have a good quality of life, they need to have a safe and clean environment where all of the environmental impacts that they may be facing are not degrading their quality of life, which leads into point B, which is the deterrence and reduction and elimination of pollution burdens. As we saw in the transportation presentation, there is a lot of freeways that are located now near disadvantaged communities or low-income communities. And these often release a lot of chemicals that hinder a good quality of life. Also, from the perspective of food and making sure that it's accessible, a lot of stores near disadvantaged communities will not have fresh quality food. And so it becomes much more difficult for community members to access these components of health that are very important. The second one, or the third one, is government entities engaging in providing technical assistance. Part of environmental justice is not just to create a plan and have that plan include community objectives, but it's also about providing technical assistance. And this is important because oftentimes when you go into disadvantaged communities, you can't expect residents to engage fully if they're not aware of what a general plan means. They're not, if they're not aware of how policies affect them and their community that they live in. They cannot participate fully if they don't know the jargon language that you might be using to try to communicate what you want from them. So it's really important that we provide them with the tools, we take the time to listen to them, we take the time to teach them so that they understand what the planning process is like. They understand why they're coming to meetings, why they're participating, and know that it will have an effect on their communities. And lastly, D, at a minimum, the meaningful consideration of those recommendations. We know that community members know what is best in their community. They are the experts. They experience the adverse effects that take place in their community. They have been there for a long time and they have seen how changes have occurred. And so they can tell you what are the things that they want to change. And they also too have ideas of how they would like to attain those goals and objectives that they have. So I want to move. So this is just a slide. By the way, these are slides by the the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. I previously had a presentation with them, and I thought this was just very important information for everyone to know in case they're working on environmental justice. So these are the topic areas that should be addressed in an EJ element. But I also want to highlight that it's important to understand that although these are the requirements, which you see down below, to reduce pollution exposure, promote public facilities, promote food access, you also have to understand what are the things that are taking place in your disadvantaged communities. What are the important topics that they consider that should be addressed? One of those things that Tulare County considered that was very important and that added a section to their element was water contamination and crime prevention. We understood that because of the conditions that existed in many of disadvantaged communities, there was always a fear of crime due to the lack of lighting and provision. And as well as water contamination, Tulare County is a place where a lot of communities have access to groundwater. However, due to the use of pesticides and a lot of other agricultural procedures that take place, there is a lot of contamination. And so you have homes that are using water that is highly contaminated and that residents are using for cooking, for showering, washing their hands. So you have to understand what is important to your community and what also relates to them or resonates with them. I want to talk about the process that you can go through to understand where your disadvantaged communities are. The Governor's Office of Planning and Research really promotes SB 1000 Toolkit, which is written by PlaceWorks as well as the California Environmental Justice Alliance. And they have a toolkit with sections of what you should be addressing. So all the sections that I just demonstrated, they go through the data that you need to attain for those sections or considerations for you to consider. But the CalEnviroScreen is by the California EPA, and they go through various indicators to understand what a disadvantaged community is. Some of those are environmental, others are affordability of housing, and others are the adverse effects that you might see, like pollution, pesticide usage, diesel, PM. So a lot of these indicators were used to filter out which communities are being most heavily affected. However, you can also understand what a disadvantaged community is through understanding the statewide median income, or trying to understand the Departments of Housing and Community Development's state income limits. They have set a quantitative or number to determine which is low income, and you can tell, what I want to say is you can use these figures to understand where you need to focus your attention on. So I want to mention that not a lot of people know that, so everyone knows about the CalEnviroScreen, or at least a lot of people do, and they're able to look at their disadvantaged communities through the map. But not everyone knows that the OEHHA has a different Google Drive where they have separated those indicators to look at sensitive populations. And this was an example that I wanted to put on housing burden, because after looking at the CalEnviroScreen and taking into account the top 25% or percentile of the communities that we wanted to select or study, we also looked at the various indicator maps to see what was particularly important in Tulare County for us to look at. We knew that housing was a huge component that affects many residents in rural communities. So we wanted to understand if we were looking at the right census tracts, if we were looking at the right communities, because overall, you might have communities in the top 25 percentile that are considered disadvantaged, but you might know of other communities that are severely disadvantaged, but don't make that top 25%. So you just want to be mindful to look at all the other indicators that you might be able to tell where your sensitive populations are. This was just a map that I wanted to include. This is the CalEnviroScreen. And if you can tell, there is differences in the CalEnviroScreen with what you see in the housing burden. There's some census tracts that have a higher burden just looking at the indicator of housing, while in the CalEnviroScreen, it's a completely different map because you have all the indicators aggregated, essentially. So all the dots that you see are a combination of the disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged communities that we decided to take a look at. We have 28 disadvantaged communities that we focused our attention on. And then we selected 10 comparable communities. And I do want to mention that from my experience, you want to make sure before you select your communities that you try to find out if those communities have data. Something that was very difficult for us after selecting our disadvantaged communities was going to the Census Bureau and trying to track down data for each of our communities, and then finding that because they're too small or because they were not designated places, there was not sufficient data. And so the comparison, the comparables, we couldn't make a statistical comparison because no data was found for some of the communities. So that's just a tip that I want to give you guys. I want to move on to the planning process. The diagram that you see here is a diagram that I took from the California Environmental Justice Alliance toolkit. They suggest that you do research, then engagement, then development, and then adopt. However, I do want to say that engagement should be happening throughout your entire process, from the beginning to the end. I want to advocate for this strongly because what I found out was that there was a lot of community-based organizations that thought that community members should know before you start your engagement or before you start the development and the research what you're going to do, because there is so much participation that can happen. Or if you tell your community residents that you're going to be working with what you're doing, there's going to be far more support. Also, they're going to be understanding what you're trying to get at, and there's just going to be better communication throughout the whole process. What we found was that if we did research and we did data first, and then we started writing our sections, then we had to do more work in trying to communicate the whole process rather than starting from the beginning and working and having cross collaboration. I want to move forward and say that Tulare County had 2 phases. And the first phase is the one I worked on primarily. However, there was, the line kind of got blurred between phase 1 and phase 2. But Tulare County had the idea of mimicking or taking the same approach that Sacramento County did. Sacramento County adopted their environmental justice element in December 17th, 2019. This year's 2019. And they took a 2-phase approach. So they did some outreach in the first phase, but their first phase mostly concentrated on baseline research. So understanding what your communities are and what is existing there. The second one is scoping of existing EJ policies. So going through your general plan and understanding which policies direct or have a correlation with the environmental justice work that you're planning to do. And I want to be clear on that. What I did within the first few months of taking on this work was that I went through every element in the general plan. And I read every policy, and I mapped out which policies address the EJ topics that we were going to be talking about in the EJ element. And I made a chart. And I categorized every policy that directly had a correlation with environmental justice through the topic areas. So if it had to do with food, I put it under food access. If it had to do with public utilities, I categorized it. So there was, in the end, there was about 10 categories, so that we understood how many policies we had to look at and how many we had to take a look at with the community and other community-based organizations, so that we can get modification recommendations of how we could either switch the language or how we could make them more robust so that it addressed specific issues that were taking place in the disadvantaged communities that we were taking a look at. The second one, like I mentioned, or the third one, is limited policy development. Policy development, I understand that is something very difficult for some cities or jurisdictions, because there is an understanding that business is business, and that there is a challenge between doing the right thing and doing things that have been playing on for years or decades. In Tulare County or in the Central Valley, agriculture and dairy is a huge business. That's where the money is. So creating a policy that maybe hindered the income that a dairy would receive, or making a policy that distorted or tried to derail how things were done in agriculture, would be a huge issue for many people. So limited policy development was a way that we tried to understand how people within the communities that we were working in wanted to change policy, and how also community-based organizations wanted to change policy in the general plan, get their ideas and write those down, but then have another phase where then we would pitch those ideas to the Planning Commission or Board of Supervisors to get their ideas on it and get their feedback. This was a way that we could do the work that needed to be done in terms of addressing what policy change would look like, but not trying to swallow the whole elephant all at the same time. The second, or the last phase one component was the strategic civic engagement. And we did this through, it was very difficult, to be honest, because this was right when the pandemic hit. In February, we started noticing that we were not going to be doing as much outreach as we had previously planned for. However, we noticed, or we took into account, that civic engagement could also be done through the organizations that had heavily been working with those disadvantaged communities. And so what we did is we created an EJ advisory committee. And before, it was an informal committee. We just invited the community organizations that we thought really were working on some of the topic areas that we wanted to address, and that would give us really good feedback, that we're working with community advocates already in those communities. And we wanted to be having this dialogue of what they thought should be implemented, what they thought we should be addressing, and making sure that our actions and our procedures were just or inclusive and equitable. So after we formalized the committee, and we also started to pitch the idea that it be a formal committee, and so it actually became an ad hoc committee after we pitched to the Planning Commission in Tulare County. And we were very fortunate enough to have a commissioner join us. And so we were able to have those difficult conversations that someone at the top could maybe address, but also it gave an opportunity for discussion and recommendations to come through from the community organizations that had heard from communities to the Planning Commission. And this also just allowed for transparency, making sure that the voices that the community-based organizations were representing were heard. After the phase two, which is something that Tulare County is now going to be working on, is creating those robust public engagement strategies. Before I left, we started to engage with community members and the community-based organizations around how we could use mixed mediums like social media, but also how do we engage with communities physically. So that's something that I'll be also sharing some of those ideas and strategies that we came up with. The second phase would just be to go back on that research, that data collection, and hear from those communities, have them review what was written and get their feedback and recommendations as to what is not being addressed, what needs to be changed, and to hear back on their ideas of what objectives they would like to have in the general plan. These are some of the groups that we had in our EJ committee. We had Audubon, California, which does a lot of rehabilitation of natural and environmental environments. We had the Central California Environmental Justice Network. They had been working a lot with tribe nations as well as Hispanic communities and people of color. We had self-help enterprises. They contributed a lot regarding to housing, policy around housing and affordability, but also civic engagement. And then we had Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. There were huge advocates for making sure that the environmental justice process was done equitably, and we included all community members. Again, 29 communities is a lot. So it really takes a lot of work and I think creativity to be able to come up with solutions of how do you access everyone that's out in your jurisdiction. These are just, this is, again, these slides will be shared, so I might not go through everything I'm not going to talk about everything in a thorough way, but this is just a diagram that was created by OPR, which is kind of takes you through what it really means to engage with the community members, consult, involve, collaborate. All of these are different ways that you can communicate, but which one, you have to ask yourself which one is the most effective and which one will gain the trust of the community members that you're going to be working with. So I would like to share some of the experiences that I had with community members out in the communities, because I think it's very important to share our stories, because we gain a lot from stories. Thousands of years ago, when people were hunters and gatherers, they understood their environment and they really got to know their history and how to improve as a civilization through stories. So I think it's very important. And I would like to begin my story with talking about different ways that you might do outreach. And one of them is one-on-one communication. And I would like to begin my story with a resident that I spoke to. Her name was Iris. And Iris lived out in East Orosi, which is northeast of Tulare County. And it's a community that is often classified as dangerous or very extremely disadvantaged and unsafe, where a lot of crime may take place. And I remember driving there on a Saturday afternoon, and I felt very scared. I felt very scared. My heart was racing because I didn't know what I was going to confront. And I think whenever you approach a community, there's always a different interaction that you're going to have with community residents. What I want to mention about Iris is that Iris was not the first person that I talked to when I got out of my car. But there were many conversations before her that led up to talking to her, because those conversations were around her household. Iris was the household owner. However, she had multiple families living in her household. And I ended up talking to two of them before talking to Iris about just some of the issues that I had read about. After doing some literature review, I came into the community trying to assess whether what I had read was relevant to community members, whether it still applied, and whether there was any other issues that they had not mentioned in the literature that I was reading that I could implement into the general plan amendment. So I ended up talking to them about housing, safety, street lighting, water, and they all mentioned that these were issues. However, they were not very interested in speaking to me about them. And what really stood out to me about Iris was that she was very passionate about community outreach work. She had been working with youth. She had been working with women that had been through domestic violence. And she had been organizing resources to allocate them to these communities. And for so long, she wanted to go to public meetings that were either at the county or the planning commission, but she felt so often that she was not allowed privilege into these meetings. There was a point that she started crying, and she told me that she needed, or the community needed, more people like me, but I want to say more people like planners who are willing to step out into the community and be vulnerable and have discussions. What I want to share, the reason why I want to share about that is because I have these questions that I think apply to all the conversations that you might have with community residents. And one of those questions is, how does each community resident fit in the context of the community? Like I mentioned, not everyone's going to want to be talking to you. And so you want to be able to classify who's going to be willing to participate and how do they want to participate, as well as what is their knowledge around the community or the issues in their communities, and are they passionate about those things, and how long have they been in their community? Because from that, you're able to assess how much they're invested in making sure that solutions are brought to the table. The second question is, how does the resident story align with the topic areas you're going to be addressing in your EJ element? I think this is very important because every resident that you're going to talk to has a story. They all have something that is deep to their heart and that they feel very connected because it affects them every day. It's something that they're constantly thinking about, whether it is that they don't have access to healthcare clinics, whether it's because they have not been to the doctor and they're sick, whether they can't afford their rent and they're struggling to pay their mortgage or payments, whether it's they don't have good jobs and they're trying to take care of their families and they're trying to see how they can expand themselves and get the resources that they need. Or it can be that there's a lot of stressors in their community that is affecting them every day and that they feel stressed by an anxiety and they just feel unsupported by the local government that is supposed to bring solutions to them. So understand what their story is, because in this way, you're really able to engage how you can engage them in the planning process. Each element or each section in the element will have a piece for community residents where they can come to you and have those meaningful discussions, and you can implement their anecdotal information into the plan itself so that their voices are heard and seen throughout the general plan. The second one is, what are residents most passionate about and how much are they willing to contribute? I already mentioned that you want to make sure that you're spending a lot of time and effort on the people that are willing to talk to you, the people who are humble and really want to be working with you. But that doesn't mean that you want to also exclude the people that don't have the level of trust from the beginning. What I think is sometimes very difficult for us planners is that we want everyone to hop on board from the get-go. But what you also have to understand is a lot of these communities have lost the trust because they have been going to advisory committee meetings, or they've been going to committee meetings within their community or the planning board. And they've been talking about their problems. They've been talking about the challenges that they want to bring solutions or they want to have solutions to. However, they don't feel heard. And so just from experience, they're not going to engage immediately because they don't know what the benefit is going to be for them. And what the last question is, what mode of communication do they feel most comfortable with? I really want to emphasize this because from my experience, I know that some community residents want to participate in meetings, but they only want to listen. Others want to communicate. They want to tell their story. Others want to just submit something in writing or want to be a part of the review process to make sure that their neighbors' voices are implemented in the plan, or that the policies that have been written or the objectives that have also been implemented in the plan are addressing something that is true to them or something that they resonate with. So I think all of these questions are very important for you to be understanding as you're having these conversations with community residents. I want to talk about some of the strategies that Tulare County had for us to do the work, the environmental justice work, and to do civic engagement. But I also want to emphasize that it's really important that you create paid opportunities around civic engagement. Whether that be through grant funding or having money from the general fund, you want to make sure that you're making people feel that their time is valuable, that their experience is valuable, because as I already mentioned, a lot of these community residents are the experts in their communities, and they're going to community meetings for hours, or they're taking time out of their day, whether that be after work or time that they could be investing on their families or other things that they have to do to make sure that what you're working on is basically right or that it resonates with them. The second point is to establish an EJ advisory committee. This was something that I found very valuable. After looking at Sacramento County's EJ element, which as I mentioned, they adopted last year, I realized that it was very important to collaborate with other agencies on this. And so I actually ended up reaching out to them, which is another topic, or which is another thing I want to point out, that I think as planning professionals, we need to be working together. And as if you see a plan that you resonate with, or that you would like to um, copy the approach or just method that they took and what they're discussing, to maybe see your community, your disadvantaged communities, through the same lens that were used somewhere else, but also customize it, of course, to reach out to them, to have those conversations of what was successful for them, but what also didn't work, and what lessons they learned through their journey. So as I mentioned, we established an EJ advisory committee because we had heard from Sacramento that it was a great way to get community-based organizations and public agencies on board, because as you'll come to find out, environmental justice work is, it includes multiple sectors. It's not just going to be a planning or land use planning. It's going to be a consideration of transportation, food justice, affordability, housing, making sure community development. So there's a lot of different components that a lot of people can contribute. And a way that you can really benefit from that cross collaboration is to be also asking them about the community members that they're already working with. A lot of these agencies or nonprofits already have a network that they're working with within disadvantaged communities. They have identified the community leaders that are willing to step up to the plate and have give you recommendations and are knowledgeable about planning and want to share their stories. So it's just a way, it's a platform that you can have very meaningful discussions with the agencies that are in your county, as well as the community residents. The third one is to create social and digital pathways for community participation. I think this is really important because now that we have the COVID-19 happening and the pandemic, and with a lot of other issues taking place, it's not very feasible to physically go out and do outreach. And so what Tulare County started doing was try to create ways that we can interact with community residents that were already plugged into some form of community in the digital world. One way that we did this was to do some research on Facebook and Instagram. Were there any community groups that had a web page or an account? We wanted to make sure that we wanted to plug into those, so that if we wanted to disseminate any information, whether that be an executive summary for each of the sections that we wrote, or we wanted to make sure that we announced when we would have a community meeting, or we wanted to make sure that we wanted to actually distribute the whole general plan, or distribute the element that we were about to publish, to get community feedback, that we can just plug into that and post what we wanted to post, so that we can get immediate feedback. The other way that you can really do this is just actually having those conversations with people, going out into communities. Something that I did was, in the beginning, before the establishment of the EJ committee, I actually connected with a lot of the community-based organizations that were in Tulare County. And I spoke with the community advocates, and I asked if they could please give me a tour of the disadvantaged communities that they were working with. But it was a very useful practice because they actually connected me with the community leaders that they were speaking with regularly. And in this way, I was able to really communicate what the county was doing, what we wanted to address or what we wanted to talk about through this process, and how they could be engaged in that process, with us. And this proved very useful because you want to make sure that you're connecting with people that have already built trust in your community and are already organizing within their communities. Lastly, one of these strategies is to create an ombudsman role, or have a planner delegate tasks to a specific planner that can be responsible for making sure that community outreach is done equitably, and that they're reaching out to all of the community members. and also are available for questions, because so often what we find is that a lot of the planners that are going to be working on plans don't have the time or don't have the capacity to be answering questions or to be engaging with community residents to the extent that is needed for us to be engaging with community residents. And so what we want to do is making sure that we have that space. We want to make sure that we have someone that's designated to make sure that they're being accountable for answering questions and receiving some of the feedback. And they're also giving those recommendations to the planning board and the planning commission. Tulare County was trying to find out how we could fund this, and we ended up finding that we wanted to apply for grants. So it's something that you can be talking about throughout the whole process of how you want to go about this, but I think it would be a great resource for each jurisdiction to have an ombudsman. These are some of the other strategies that Tulare County came up with during COVID-19. We want to make sure that these are the strategies that Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability came up with through conversation with the other members of the EJ Advisory Committee. And that was to notify the public of all hearings, times, topics, and detailed information. We wanted to make sure that every community resident had time to make time on their schedule to be able to make these meetings, or we were having these critical conversations about what was going to be taking place in each section and the data that we were going to be collecting. So you want to make sure that you're notifying everyone. And I would also recommend having a system. Something that worked for us, which is kind of, it was a system that worked for us, but that could be improved, was cold calling, and as well as flyers. We ended up cold calling individuals about the work that we were doing, when we were going to have meetings. And then we also distributed flyers to have those conversations, just to reinforce what we had talked about on the phone. I think it's really important to send multiple reminders to community residents so that they're constantly aware of when events will take place. And I think the more that they see how much effort you're willing to put into reaching out to them and having those conversations, the more energy that you put into this movement, and the more they feel like something's actually going to happen and they need to start getting involved. At least that's what we experienced. The second point is to reach out to residents early to make sure that the residents are informed and notified through multiple channels about remote options for public hearings. So this can be through Zoom, but also having phone lines, like I mentioned, Facebook, making sure that you're posting when meetings will take place, and then also be able to have those comments come back live and be able to make time to review those or address those questions that are coming through. That's something that it mentions here down below. Just want to chat. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I just wanted to check the chat. I didn't know how much time I had left, but I want to make just leave some time. So here on the left is how we started to also engage with communities. We started noticing that a lot of communities had community council groups and that they were meeting through Zoom. And a lot of these meetings had translation services available to community members. So we were having discussion in English, but at the same time, we were making space for community residents who spoke different languages to be able to have be informed of what was taking place. And also translators who were making sure that questions or comments were being translated in English so everyone understood. But I started to make presentations to community groups that were meeting virtually. And in this way, I was able to get an understanding of what community groups were already talking about within their communities and what was important to them. This was a way that we started to identify how we could engage different communities in informing various sections of the element. And it was also a way, like right now, where a lot of us are in different places, and we can't really gather together. It was a way for the Board of Supervisor or the Planning Commissioner or other important people that we were really working with to engage with community residents. Because a lot of the time you'll have communities who are pretty far apart, and so you can't really go out into all of them at the same time. And this is one way that everyone can come into one meeting. The other way is having those conversations as a group, but I know right now that's not really feasible. Anyways, I know that was a review of everything that took place, but I wanted to leave my email and phone number and also LinkedIn account. If anyone has any specific questions about environmental justice, or if they want to just have an casual conversation of how your jurisdiction is addressing some of these challenges, and also would like to hear more about Tulare County, please let me know. I would love to have a conversation with you and be a part of making sure that your environmental justice work is done equitably and has inclusivity involved throughout the whole process.
Arlen, thank you so much for this presentation. As the group might have noticed, we gave Arlen 40 minutes because we really wanted to emphasize the California part of it. And because he's from the Central Valley and one of the first to work in environmental justice and social equity into a general plan per SB 1000 requirements. So this is really terrific. I know I picked up a lot of things. The thread of conversation was really hopping while you were speaking. Lots of really good comments. We're running a little bit short on time, but what I would like to do is, because there was so much interest in your particular presentation, Arlen, give you a chance to maybe look at some of those comments and respond to some of them. And maybe what we can do is tighten up that last portion of the breakouts, although I think the breakouts have been fantastic and they're a really good place to reflect. So what I think I want to do is change the order around a little bit. Maru is now back on, and Maru is our Vice President of Equity and Diversity at the California APA. But she mentioned that she's having a couple of problems with her microphone. And so I wanted to maybe make some closing observations about the whole workshop today, give Arlen an opportunity to maybe expand upon some of the comments that were in the thread, and then we can finish by breaking out, and then people can stay on the breakouts for as long or as short as they want or have time. And so that might provide more flexibility. So some people who have more time can stay on longer, and those who have to wrap up their Friday afternoon can maybe stay on a little bit shorter. So let me go ahead and close with some of my observations, and then we'll come back to you, Arlen. But I wanted to, first of all, thank all of the panelists, all of the speakers. You guys were all terrific. And one of the things I particularly liked about this workshop was the breadth of topics that were discussed, and really looking at this as we're trained to do in planning school, right, from a comprehensive perspective. And I think that was really terrific. There's so many things that is new to different people. So some of us know some things and some know other things, but I think we all have picked up on a couple of things and maybe learned things today that were new to us. I loved how Arlen talked about telling the stories, really listening to the people that we're working with in these communities, because sometimes as planners, and we talked about this at one of the breakout sessions I was at, we get really focused on the data and on the quantitative analysis, but there's so much more that we can get from that qualitative analysis, and we have to give it some sort of equal weight. And now understanding that equity and diversity really needs to be factored into the planning process, taking those stories into account and getting to the people who can tell us the stories that they, the impacts that they deal with on a daily basis. So I really appreciate that about Arlen's presentation. And also he talked about some ways to communicate and some of the basics, like getting back to telephone calls and cold calling. I mean, we're so far into technology that sometimes the basics can go really far. So that was really fantastic. I loved how Christoph really challenged us to think about what equity means in terms of infrastructure and service investments. And I thought that was really, really terrific. He challenged us on our notions of transit planning and Title VI analysis, and really thinking about what we're doing and speaking up when we see things that maybe aren't going the way that we think they should from an equity standpoint. So thank you, Christoph, for that. Dr. Berglund, one of the things I really liked about her presentation was bringing the attention to the concentration of health disparities in a particular space, right? So we've all heard of, as planners, how zip code can really affect your health outcomes and even the length of your life. And I think her examples were so clear and articulate from the research that she had done, and bringing it all together and tying that back to race and to inequitable investments and continued investments that were also not equitable was very helpful to see. Desiree, her distinctions between equity, inclusion, and diversity, those terms, I thought it was really helpful that she gave some distinctions between those definitions, because now, as she mentioned, we have a lot of buzzwords out there and sometimes we may not understand those distinctions clearly. So to provide a little bit of clarity on that was helpful. Dr. Dessou, the system-wide efforts happening in Portland as an example, you know, of what can happen at the citywide level, I thought was really, really helpful. And then of course, all of the videos. In one of the breakouts I was in, one of the participants talked about how helpful it is to have videos because you can share them, they're short, and we're not experts on everything. And then you can get people to give you their impressions of them, but they can be used as a learning tool. So all of these resources are available for you for free. The links to everything, the links to the videos, the links to the articles, all of these PowerPoint slides and videos, everything will be made available to you. Most everything is already included in the program. So I wanted to make one last comment before I turn it back over to Arlen. If you have any additional statements that you'd like to make, Arlen, based on the thread there. But I want to thank the state APA for their leadership. Maru, who is on the line now, but hasn't had an opportunity to speak. She was having some technical difficulties with her microphone. So she mentioned that she wasn't really going to speak to the group, but I did want to just send a huge compliment her way, because she personally has been working with each of the equity chairs across the state of California, all of the APA sections, and really providing that leadership to provide resources available to everyone. If you have not had a chance to look at the state APA web link, Julia sent it out, but it's also in the program. The number of resources that are on that website is truly incredible. So I really strongly encourage people to take a look at that, to read up, to look at the videos. Articles, I think they're posting articles literally on a daily basis. And I think it's just absolutely a great resource. So I want to thank you all for attending and spending this much time out of your busy schedules. I really appreciate that. And so anyways, with that, I'll hand it back over to Arlen in case you have any last comments that you wanted to make. And if anyone else wants to make any comments, or any of the speakers that are still on that want to add anything after Arlen says a couple of last words, anyone else is welcome to jump in as well.
Right, thank you, Carolina. So I believe there was kind of two questions, and one of them has already partly been addressed. One of them was from Jane, and is the 75% threshold called out in the EJ element guidelines? And as Vicky mentioned, yes, pursuant to the Health and Safety Code section 397111, Cal EPA designates that it needs to either be at the 75% threshold or above. But I would recommend that there were some communities in Tulare County that were perhaps not within this threshold, but that community advocates really pointed out to us, these communities are receiving some of those adverse effects that you're talking about and that you're trying to address. So why don't we put them into the list of communities that we're going to be analyzing or taking into account into our environmental studies. And so we did. So I think it's a great way. Again, don't take the CalEnviro screen as a concrete way of just putting the 25 the disadvantaged communities in the top 25 percentile as true fact. You also want to be able to assess which communities are, which you know about, are going through a lot of those inequitable conditions that we've been discussing. The second question was, how do you engage with communities? Something along those lines, especially how do you involve and educate communities? Well, I think that process, it can start very slow. And this is why I mentioned that it should be, engagement should start from the beginning, because you really want to build up that knowledge that community members have, so that throughout your whole process, they're learning what the general plan is, what elements are, what policies and objectives are, and how that relates to them. What we started doing was that we actually sat down with residents and we just went through the general plan. We said, this is what the general plan is. This is how it addresses needs and challenges in communities. And we just try to answer their questions and try to make it a learning process where they were really understanding how it applied to them. But it might be slow. It builds up, but I think the more fun you make this process and the more engaged and interactive you make it, it's something that it brings people's attention. One way that we were thinking about doing this is having story maps. I don't want to go on for too long, but story maps were, we wanted to, on a virtual like GIS map, we wanted to have every disadvantaged community, or I saw something that said disinvested, and I like that, disinvested community on a map. And we wanted to have a short summary or a description of where that community was, what are some of the challenges and needs that they have discussed with us, and what are some of the barriers that they currently face. And then also we wanted to make sure that some of the stories that we had heard from residents within those communities were also on that story map. And this is a great way for people just to understand what the landscape is like and what environmental justice work looks like within the separate communities that you're going to be looking at.
Okay, so Arlen, thanks for those last statements. Do any of the other speakers have anything they want to add? No, okay, I'm seeing Mario say no. Casey, did you want to add anything? Maru, anything in particular? Arlen, and then I'm not sure if some of the others are still on. I did want to wrap up by saying that I heard a presentation, I believe it was just yesterday, and it was a woman who was speaking about equity and said that we have an opportunity to undo a lot of the harm that has been done. And I think as planners that really applies to us, and everything that Arlen was talking about really factors into this. So we are almost at 3 o'clock. I think what we should do now is anyone who would like to participate in another 5 minutes of conversation to stay on the line. And anyone who isn't interested should go ahead and get off. And then maybe we can just open up the conversation to anyone who still wants to stay on for another 5 minutes. So, and as Maru is saying, in the end, please do not forget to vote. Thank you for that reminder. And we'll just open it up for general discussion. So if you want to speak, take yourself off mute and we'll have a last couple of minutes of conversation. Thank you all for making the time today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. All right, so we still have, we still have a lot of people on here. Well, does anybody want to say anything? I'll just open it up completely. This is my mom, by the way. You probably saw Carmen Illich. This is my mom, who she's a big supporter of me and she comes to a lot of my things. So Mama, I love you. We're born in Chile, so we got the Spanish thing going. Thanks, Lisa, excellent speakers. It's great to see all the comments. So anyone want to say anything?
I want to say thank you, Carolina, for putting this on and all the effort that you did to get this going. I think it was very worthwhile and a great selection of speakers.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Definitely interesting things to learn today.
Yeah, definitely. Will there be any more, 103 or 105s?
Well, fill out your surveys. We take those really seriously. And if you have any more suggestions for topics, then we'll take a look at those and organize some additional sessions based on that. But yeah, absolutely. In fact, Casey and Mario have been working very diligently on putting a work program together for equity for our section. I know, Sean, you're in our section, so that's great. And, they talked a little bit about that work program before. And so we'll continue to put as many resources out there as we possibly can. And then as Casey mentioned, we want to share as much as we can with the state chapter and or other chapters that are out there, because this is really a lot of new material for a lot of people. So we want to be as helpful as we can in the process. But yeah, we're open to feedback and we want to hear what everyone thinks.
Arlen, I had a quick, so that process, how long did it take, and do you recall a budget?
Right. So I was, as a Civic Spark fellow, you're basically contracted as a consultant because you're working with the local government commission, and your fellowship is 11 months. So I know I don't really know the specifics of how much a public agency pays for a fellow, but I know that it's less than they pay a consulting firm. And
it costs a lot.
Yes, you do. But the process that I went through, the whole research, actually generating a whole amendment, was 11 months. But I would say that a lot of it, for the first 5 months, it was just trying to get things going and understanding what those requirements were. We actually did not write and implement all the information that we had gathered from community residents until the last 5 months. So it came together.
And was it the agency that hired you, or was it through a consulting firm? How do you get the Civic Spark people hired?
Right. So I think they go through, there's an interview process that each local public agency goes through with, I think, the local government commission, and then they're connected with Civic Spark staff, and then fellows or prospective fellows go through an interview process, and they find out what that fellow's experience is with land use planning, transportation, whatever it is. And then they match prospective fellows with public agencies, and then they also do an interview with them, so that you make sure that you're matching the people with the right skills and the work that they want to engage with.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Carolina?
Yes.
Celeste, I have two comments. One's a question.
Okay.
And one is an observation. I'm noticing now in Santa Clara County, which is basically San Jose area, some of the local jurisdictions at a council level or just slightly below are creating task forces on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know Santa Clara has now in San Jose, and I was wondering if anyone else is noticing that from wherever you might be. And the other is just a basic question to the group in general. Has anyone ever seen a study that compares the makeup of city council versus the makeup of the demographics of their community?
Well, that was one of the reasons they outlawed having city council that's, at large, was so that they'd be more representative of their communities or, districts.
I often notice, though, that the city councils might be the businessmen and women, or the local large farm owners, or something of that sort, and may not represent the majority of their demographics of their community.
Right. Which is also a problem with community planning groups. And that's again where structural racism comes in, that often the community planning group makeup is the business community and doesn't reflect the actual demographics of that community.
Yeah, I think that's the responsibility of the planner, to recognize that and then to seek out those additional voices that aren't being heard.
And have maybe more powerful positions on at least the planning commission or whatever you have in your communities.
Yeah, I've noticed this a lot. It really, here and I'm sure everywhere, just comes down to communication and engagement. And Arlen had so many great, great tips and ways to get engaged with the communities. because it's hard sometimes being locked in outside of City Hall, and they don't even, other communities don't feel like they're even welcome there. So you kind of have to go out and engage with them. Go to, if you see events in the park or something, stop in and say, hey, I'm city planner, here's business cards. If you ever have any questions, just get out there, go out on the weekends, knock on some doors after COVID's done, so that's, exactly on us.
Celeste, I don't have any information on your question about task forces. I think that's a really good question. And I apologize, but I have to leave the meeting for another meeting, a 3 p.m. meeting. And I hope by me leaving, it doesn't, cut you all off, but we'll see what happens. But thank you all so much. I really appreciate your participation. And Mama, I'll see you later tonight. Bye, guys.
Bye.